I walked away from my family 7 years ago with $270, one backpack, and a college scholarship they demanded I reject. They told everyone in our community I was selfish. They erased me from their lives. Last month, my brother found my name online for the first time in 7 years. He called my dad crying. Then my mom called. Then my cousins. Within just 24 hours, I had 45 voicemails on a phone number I had kept alive for exactly this reason. Every single message said the exact same 5 words. We are losing the house. Before I tell you exactly how I responded to those 5 words and how I orchestrated the ultimate downfall of the people who threw me away, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. Now let me bring you into the room where the trap was finally sprung. My name is Claire. I am 29 years old, and I am an audit partner and forensic accountant at one of the top financial investigation firms in Chicago. I dismantle corporate fraud for a living. I track hidden money. I find the offshore accounts, the forged signatures, the phantom shell companies that greedy men use to steal from hardworking people. I had spent my entire 20s proving that I did not need the people who shared my DNA. I built my career from the ground up, starting in a cramped cubicle and working 80-hour weeks until I earned my partnership. Now my name is on the glass door. My signature authorizes multi-million-dollar asset seizures. I built a fortress of competence and independence. I am very good at my job because I learned early in life that people lie, but numbers never do. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Thunder rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows of my 30th floor office, overlooking the Chicago River. The sky was the color of bruised iron, pouring heavy sheets of rain against the glass. I was sitting at my massive mahogany desk, surrounded by tall stacks of federal banking records, balance sheets, and tax returns. I had a cup of black coffee going cold next to my keyboard. The room was perfectly quiet, except for the muffled sound of the rain and the soft clicking of my computer mouse. I was deep into a massive commercial mortgage fraud investigation. A major regional bank had hired my firm to audit a luxury real estate development company that was suddenly defaulting on tens of millions of dollars in commercial loans. Forensic accounting is not just about crunching numbers. It is hunting. You look for patterns where there should be chaos, and you look for chaos where there should be patterns. For 3 solid weeks, my dedicated team of junior auditors and I had been tearing apart this real estate company's ledgers line by line. In modern American real estate, leveraging assets is common, but what this company was doing was blatantly illegal. The executives running the company had been cross-collateralizing residential properties to back incredibly high-risk commercial ventures. It was a classic Ponzi scheme setup, hidden behind layers of corporate jargon and fake shell companies. They were moving money from one account to another, intentionally inflating asset values and bribing independent property appraisers to look the other way. When the commercial projects inevitably stalled, the banks came calling for their money, and now the collateral was being called in. The bank was preparing to seize every single asset tied to the loans. The deeper I dug into the file, the more obvious their arrogance became. The perpetrators left a trail of digital breadcrumbs so wide and so obvious that a first-year accounting student could have spotted it. They truly thought they were untouchable. They operated with the blind confidence of people who believed the rules simply did not apply to them. I was reviewing the final asset forfeiture documents. I was just about to draft the official recommendation to the federal authorities to freeze all of their corporate and personal bank accounts when the absolute silence in my office was abruptly broken. My personal cell phone began to vibrate against the polished wood of my desk. It was an older device, a secondary phone I kept strictly for personal emergencies. I had maintained this exact phone number for 7 long years. I paid the bill every single month. I never changed the digits. Part of me kept it because it was the only piece of my past I had not completely thrown away. But the much larger part of me, the forensic accountant part, kept it as a silent trap. I knew that one day, eventually, the past would come looking for me. The phone vibrated once, then twice, then a third time. I did not pick it up. I simply watched the screen light up with the phone number from an Ohio area code. It was a number I had forced myself to memorize when I was just a child. It was my father, Richard. The screen went dark. Then it instantly lit up again. This time the caller ID showed my mother, Susan. My pulse stayed perfectly steady. I did not feel the panic I used to feel when I was a terrified teenager living under their suffocating roof. I did not feel the old urge to answer immediately and apologize for whatever I had supposedly done wrong. I just felt a cold, sharp, calculating focus. The phone stopped ringing. Then it chimed with a voicemail notification. Then another. Then another. The notifications began rolling in like a cascading avalanche. Ping, ping, ping. It did not stop. I leaned back in my heavy leather executive chair. I picked up the phone and looked at the screen. 45 missed calls, 45 new voicemails, all within the span of a few short hours. I unlocked the screen, pressed the phone to my ear, and tapped play on the very first message. The voice that came through the small speaker was frantic, high-pitched, and trembling with a raw, ugly kind of terror. It was Brad, my older brother, the undeniable golden child of our family, the boy who could do absolutely no wrong, the man who had been handed every single opportunity, every dollar, every ounce of praise on a silver platter while I was told to scrape by on absolutely nothing. Brad was hyperventilating. His breathing was ragged and shallow like a man drowning. He said my name, Claire. Claire, please pick up the phone. Please tell me you still have this number. Claire, you have to help me. You have to call me back right now. We are losing the house. The message ended with a sharp click. I did not blink. Hearing Brad hyperventilate was a surreal experience. This was the boy who used to smirk at me across the dinner table when my parents handed him the keys to a brand new car while I walked 3 miles to my part-time job. This was the man who always wore custom-tailored suits and posted pictures of his expensive golf club memberships online. Now he sounded like a terrified little boy hiding in a corner. The arrogance was completely gone, washed away by the very real threat of federal prison. I pressed play on the next voicemail. This one was from my father, Richard. The man who had once looked me dead in the eyes pointed to the front door and told me I was no longer a part of his family because I refused to give up my college scholarship to fund Brad's lifestyle. Listening to my father beg was even stranger. Richard was a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in his image. He loved to stand on his manicured lawn and lecture the neighbors about financial responsibility and hard work. He loved to pretend his wealth was the result of superior intellect. Now the facade was cracking. The country club membership, the leased luxury cars, the perfectly curated suburban life, it was all built on a foundation of stolen money. His voice was not authoritative or booming anymore. It was hollow, stripped of all his false dignity. Claire, he said, his voice breaking, it is your dad. Please call us. It is an emergency. Your brother is in terrible trouble. We are losing the house. I pressed play on the third message. It was my mother, Susan, the woman who had literally packed my few belongings in black plastic garbage bags and tossed them onto the porch in the rain. She was sobbing. Actual wet, gasping sobs that sounded like they were tearing up her throat. She had not cried when she watched me walk into a thunderstorm at 22 years old, but she was crying now because her comfortable life was evaporating. Claire, my sweet girl, she cried, using a pet name she had never once used when I actually lived with her. Please call your mother. We need you. Brad needs you so much right now. We are losing the house. I sat in the quiet of my office and listened to message after message, 45 times. Cousins I had not spoken to since high school. An aunt who used to mock my thrift store clothes at Thanksgiving dinners. They all called. They all left voicemails. They all repeated that exact same phrase like it was a rehearsed script handed down from a tragedy. We are losing the house. They sounded utterly destroyed. They sounded like their entire carefully curated, wealthy suburban world was collapsing around them in real time. They were desperate, grasping at straws, reaching out to the daughter they had discarded, hoping I would be their savior. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have felt a sudden rush of familial duty, a desperate, ingrained urge to dial back and save their flesh and blood from total financial ruin. I did not feel any of that. I felt nothing but the icy chill of absolute clarity. I slowly lowered the phone to my desk, placing it right next to my cold cup of coffee. I took a deep breath, the air cool and sterile in my high-rise office. I looked back at the open federal fraud file glowing brightly on my large computer monitor. I looked at the names listed on the official incorporation documents of the fraudulent real estate firm I was about to completely dismantle. the company that had stolen tens of millions of dollars, the company whose federal assets I was about to permanently freeze with a single signature. The CEO listed on the top line of the federal indictment file was Bradley Thomas, my brother, and the primary financial co-signers on the fraudulent commercial loans were Richard and Susan Thomas, my parents. This was not a coincidence. This was not a random twist of fate. This was my desk. This was my audit, and I was the one holding the pen that would end their entire empire. I stared at the glowing screen of my monitor. The digital ledgers of Bradley Thomas told a story of staggering greed and absolute entitlement. As a forensic accountant, I do not just look at bottom lines or balance sheets. I read the history of human behavior written in deposits and withdrawals. My eyes traced the initial capitalization documents for his so-called luxury real estate firm. There it was, the official founding date of the corporation, August 14th, 7 years ago. Seeing that exact date did not just ring a quiet bell in my mind. It violently ripped open a locked vault. The sleek, modern walls of my Chicago office suddenly faded away. The muffled hum of the downtown traffic 20 stories below vanished completely. In the blink of an eye, I was 22 years old again, and my clothes smelled heavily of stale diner coffee and cheap fry grease. 7 years ago, I was working grueling double shifts at a rundown diner on the outskirts of my hometown. I was exhausted to the very marrow of my bones. My feet ached constantly from standing on hard tile floors, and my hands were perpetually chapped and cracked from industrial dish soap. But I did not care about the physical pain because I had a singular burning focus. I was putting myself through my undergraduate accounting program entirely on my own. My parents, Richard and Susan, had made it abundantly clear the day I turned 18 that my college education was my own financial burden. They claimed they believed in teaching the value of a hard-earned dollar. They said character was built through struggle, but that strict philosophy only applied to me. It never applied to Brad. Brad was 2 years older than me. He was the undeniable golden child of our household. He had my mother's charming smile, my father's tall build, and the uncanny ability to talk his way out of absolutely any consequence. While I was scrubbing hardened grease-off plates to afford my used textbooks, Brad was driving a brand new sports sedan that my parents bought for him as a college graduation gift. He had coasted through a generic business degree on their dime, spending most of his time at fraternity parties and weekend getaways. When he graduated, he moved right back into his large childhood bedroom entirely rent-free. He confidently declared that entry-level corporate jobs were beneath his vast potential. He needed to be his own boss. He needed an empire. My parents completely agreed with him. They looked at Brad and saw a brilliant visionary who just needed a little push. They looked at me and saw a convenient workhorse. That August, I experienced the single greatest triumph of my young life. After years of flawless grades and endless applications, I received an acceptance letter for a highly competitive Master of Accounting program, along with a full-ride academic scholarship. It covered my entire tuition, my books, and even provided a small living stipend. It was my golden ticket. It was my guaranteed escape route out of the diner and into the high-stakes corporate world I had always dreamed of. I remember running almost the entire way home from the mailbox, clutching that thick envelope in my hands. I burst through the front door of our suburban house completely out of breath and practically vibrating with pure joy. I found my parents and Brad sitting comfortably in the living room watching television. I held up the letter. I announced that I had gotten the full ride. I stood there panting, waiting for the cheers. I waited for my mother to jump up and hug me. I waited for my father to finally look at me and tell me he was proud of the woman I was becoming. Instead, the room fell completely suffocatingly silent. Richard and Susan exchanged a heavy, significant look. Brad simply scrolled through his phone, looking mildly annoyed by my sudden interruption. Finally, my father reached for the television remote, muted the volume, cleared his throat, and strictly gestured for me to sit down on the opposite sofa. He announced that we needed to have a serious family meeting. He calmly explained that Brad had officially drawn up the business plan for his new luxury real estate investment firm. It was a massive once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Richard claimed, but they needed seed money. They needed immediate liquid capital to secure a flashy downtown office space, hire staff, and cover initial marketing expenses to make Brad look successful right out of the gate. My parents were already taking out a second mortgage on our family home to help him, but according to my father's calculations, it simply was not enough cash to get Brad's empire off the ground safely. My mother leaned forward and placed her manicured hand over mine. She wore a look of fake, gentle concern that I will absolutely never forget. She told me in a soft, completely reasonable tone that being part of a family requires deep sacrifice. She said that since my graduate tuition was going to be covered anyway, I did not actually need to go to school right now. The master plan they had devised for my life was simple, and they expected me to follow it without question. I was to formally decline the full ride scholarship. I was to drop out of my college program immediately. I would continue working double shifts at the greasy diner, and they strongly suggested I pick up a second job, perhaps in retail or cleaning houses on the weekends. Every single dollar I earned beyond my basic bus fare and cheap groceries was to be handed directly over to Brad to fund his real estate venture. I sat there on the floral sofa, staring at the three of them in utter disbelief. I honestly thought it was a sick, twisted joke. I asked my mother to repeat herself. Susan sighed heavily, rolling her eyes, acting as if my failure to blindly obey was a massive burden on her patience. She explained that Brad was a man who needed to build his legacy. She told me that I was a girl who was good at adapting, good at surviving on scraps. They needed my steady income to support his grand dreams until the business took off. She called it an investment in the family's future. I looked over at Brad. He was smirking, slightly casually tapping his fingers on the armrest of his leather chair. He truly believed he was entitled to my blood, my sweat, and my future. He felt absolutely no shame in asking his little sister to throw away her life to buy him a fancy office. I looked at my father, who stared back at me with cold, uncompromising expectation. They were completely serious. They wanted me to voluntarily destroy my education and my only escape route just to buy Brad an unearned shortcut to wealth. I stood up from the couch. My hands were shaking furiously at my sides, but my voice was completely steady. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, and I said absolutely not. The explosion that followed was deafening. My father leaped up from his armchair and began shouting at the top of his lungs. He called me an ungrateful, selfish, miserable child. My mother started crying dramatically, clutching her chest, claiming that I was intentionally tearing the family apart because I was jealous of my brother's brilliant potential. Brad yelled that I was a worthless loser who would be flipping burgers for the rest of my life anyway, so I might as well make myself useful to someone who actually mattered. The psychological abuse rained down on me for over an hour. They tried guilt. They tried aggressive intimidation. They tried deep-cutting shame. They threw every single manipulative tactic they had perfected over 2 decades right at my face. But I held my ground. I refused to surrender the scholarship. I refused to surrender my life to a brother who viewed me as nothing more than an ATM. I walked out of the living room, locked myself in my small bedroom, and went to work the next morning as usual. 2 days later, I came home from a brutal 14-hour shift at the diner. The sky above our quiet suburban neighborhood was turning a violent, bruising shade of purple and black. The wind was picking up rapidly, howling through the old oak trees and tearing dead leaves from the branches. A massive, violent summer thunderstorm was rolling in fast. I walked up our concrete driveway completely exhausted, my uniform smelling of onions and bleach, ready to collapse into my bed. But I never made it inside the house. Sitting on the front porch, directly in the path of the incoming rain, were 3 large black plastic garbage bags. I stopped dead in my tracks. I recognized the familiar shape of my heavy winter coat pressing sharply against the thin black plastic of one of the bags. I walked slowly up the wooden steps and saw my faded school backpack sitting squarely on top of the pile. The front door opened with a loud creak. My father stood in the doorway, physically blocking the entrance. He looked down at me with an expression of absolute chilling disgust. He did not see his daughter standing there. He saw a bad investment. He saw a defiant, broken machine that had refused to fall in line and produce money for his favorite child. I asked him what was going on. I asked him to please let me inside because the thunder was cracking and it was starting to rain. Richard looked me dead in the eye and delivered the exact words that finally broke my childhood illusions into a million jagged pieces. He said, If you cannot invest in this family, you are not part of it. Get off my property. I stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of the moment. I asked about my mother. I asked to at least speak to Susan before I left. My father simply stated that my mother had absolutely nothing to say to a selfish traitor. He stepped back. The heavy wooden front door slammed shut right in my face. I heard the loud metallic click of the deadbolt sliding securely into place. A massive crack of thunder shook the ground beneath my feet. The sky tore open and the rain began to fall in heavy freezing sheets. I was 22 years old, standing on a porch with everything I owned in the world stuffed carelessly into garbage bags. I had no car. I had no other family to call. I pulled my cheap leather wallet out of my uniform pocket with trembling fingers. I unzipped the small cash compartment and counted the money I had earned from my diner tips that week. 2 crumpled $100 bills, 3 20s, one $10 bill, $270. That was the absolute entirety of my net worth. I did not cry. Crying was a luxury I simply could not afford in that moment. I grabbed my backpack and slung it over my soaking wet shoulders. I left the garbage bags sitting on the porch because I physically could not carry them in the raging storm. I walked away from the house where I had grown up, and I did not look back. I walked for 3 miles in the pouring rain along the shoulder of the highway. My uniform was soaked completely through to my skin. My worn-out sneakers squished loudly with every single step. The biting cold seeped deep into my bones, but a burning fire of pure, unadulterated adrenaline kept my legs moving forward. I eventually found a cheap rundown roadside motel near the interstate. I paid $50 in cash for one night in a room that smelled intensely of old cigarettes and damp, moldy carpet. I sat on the edge of that sagging, terrible mattress, shivering violently in my wet clothes. I pulled my soaked phone from my pocket. I looked at the dark screen and realized that I was completely, utterly alone in the world. No one was coming to save me. My parents had thrown me away so my brother could play pretend at being a wealthy businessman. They had discarded me like trash. But as I sat there, gripping my remaining $220, a profound shift happened in my mind. The terrified 22-year-old girl died in that motel room. In her place, something cold, calculating, and unbreakable was born. I realized that being completely alone meant I was completely free. I did not owe them my future. I did not owe them my success. I only owed myself. I made a silent vow that night that I would build a life so high, so powerful, and so untouchable that they would never, ever be able to reach me again. I snapped back to the present moment. The cold, smooth leather of my executive chair grounded me against the rush of memories. The thunder rolling heavily over the Chicago skyline was absolutely nothing compared to the storm brewing on my computer monitors. I stared at the flashing red alerts on my auditing software. 45 frantic voicemails sat on my personal phone begging for salvation, but my eyes were firmly locked on the digital ledgers of Bradley Thomas. In forensic accounting, numbers are not just mathematics. They are a raw, unfiltered confession. They show exactly what a person values, what they desperately try to hide, and who they truly are when nobody is watching. Over the past 7 years, while I was working myself to the bone, eating cheap canned soup, and pulling back-to-back all-nighters to pass my rigorous CPA exams, my biological family was living an absolute delusion. I clicked open the master transaction log for Brad's supposed luxury real estate investment firm. The screen populated with thousands of rows of financial data. It did not take a seasoned auditor to see the massive glaring holes in his operation, but it took someone like me to follow the intricate web of deception he had woven. The sheer volume of the theft was breathtaking. I began to map out exactly how my family had lived over the last 7 years. They had not just survived without me. They had spent millions of dollars portraying themselves as elite wealthy socialites in their suburban community. I highlighted line after line of exorbitant, sickening expenses. There were $200,000 in initiation fees for the highly exclusive Oakwood Country Club. There were monthly dining minimums of $5,000 paid directly out of commercial escrow accounts. I traced a massive wire transfer from a supposed construction fund straight to a luxury European car dealership. Brad had leased a fleet of top-tier Porsche SUVs, one for himself, one for my father Richard, and one for my mother Susan. The money flowed like a raging river through a broken dam. The records showed first-class flights to Aspen for weekend ski trips. They showed private chartered yachts in St. Bart's during the winter holidays. I stared at the screen, my jaw tight, picturing my mother standing on the terrace of her country club. I could practically see Susan sipping expensive vintage champagne, looking down her nose at the serving staff, completely secure in her fabricated status. She always loved to perform wealth. She loved to appear infinitely superior to the working-class neighbors she lived around. She had entirely forgotten that she had thrown her own 22-year-old daughter out into a freezing thunderstorm to become one of those wealthy people. But a lavish lifestyle, built entirely on stolen investor capital, requires constant aggressive feeding. A Ponzi scheme is a beast that is never satisfied. When the legitimate money from initial investors inevitably ran dry, Brad had to get creative. He had to keep up appearances at all costs. And that is exactly when the true desperation set in. I pulled up the commercial loan origination documents from 3 years ago. The real estate market had started to cool down significantly. Brad's fraudulent shell companies were bleeding cash rapidly. He desperately needed to secure a massive commercial loan from a major regional bank to cover his failing developments, pay off the earliest angry investors, and keep the criminal scheme afloat. But the bank underwriters were not completely blind. They required hard, tangible assets. They required secure collateral to underwrite the massive financial risk. Brad had absolutely no real assets of his own. His luxury cars were leased. His flashy downtown office was rented. His designer suits and expensive watches were bought on heavily leveraged credit cards. His entire net worth was a meticulously constructed lie built on quicksand. So he turned to the only people who still bought into his genius narrative. He turned to Richard and Susan. I opened the scanned PDF of the bank's collateral agreement. My stomach tightened into a hard knot as I saw the specific property address listed on the third page of the federal document. It was the house. The exact same suburban house where I grew up. The house whose front porch I had sat on in the pouring rain alongside 2 plastic garbage bags. Richard and Susan had worked for 30 years to pay off that mortgage. They owned that 4-bedroom house completely outright. It was their ultimate financial security. It was the only real valuable asset they possessed for their retirement. But Brad convinced them to sign it away. He convinced his parents to cross-collateralize their fully owned debt-free home against his highly toxic, completely unsecured commercial junk loans. In the simplest, most brutal financial terms, Richard and Susan bet their entire future and their only shelter on Brad's lie. They signed a legally binding federal document stating that if Brad's real estate firm ever defaulted on the commercial debt, the bank had the absolute uncontestable right to seize and auction their personal home to recover the financial losses. They literally handed the bank the roof over their heads so their golden boy could keep pretending to be a real estate mogul. A tiny part of me, a deeply buried fragment of the terrified girl I used to be, almost felt a brief flicker of pity for them. For one brief fleeting second, I thought Richard and Susan were simply gullible parents. I thought they were foolish, naive older people who had been ruthlessly manipulated by a sociopathic, fast-talking son. I assumed Brad had lied to them, manipulating their unconditional love, assuring them that there was absolutely zero risk to their home. I thought they were just tragic victims of their own blind favoritism. But forensic accounting does not allow for assumptions, and it certainly does not allow for sentimentality. My profession demands absolute, undeniable proof. I moved my mouse and opened the internal corporate communications archive. My auditing firm had legally subpoenaed the entire email server for Brad's company as part of the federal fraud investigation. I decided to filter the search results specifically by my father's and mother's names. What I found in those hidden corporate emails completely eradicated any lingering shred of pity I had left in my soul. It replaced that soft emotion with an icy, unyielding, and absolute rage. Richard and Susan were not victims. They were not innocent bystanders who had been manipulated by a rogue son. They were active, willing, and incredibly greedy co-conspirators. I opened an email thread dated from exactly 4 years ago. It was sent from Richard's personal email directly to Brad's secure corporate account. The subject line read, "Urgent Country Club Assessment." In the body of the email, my father explicitly instructed Brad to take the massive cash deposit from a brand new, completely unsuspecting commercial investor and route it directly into Richard's personal checking account to cover a sudden, unexpected country club fee. Richard wrote, "Just shift the funds from the new guys like we discussed last month. They will not notice the money is missing for at least a quarter, and your mother cannot be seen downgrading our membership tier at the club. People will start asking questions." Susan was copied directly on that email. Her reply came 20 minutes later. She told Brad to make sure he categorized the theft as a legitimate consulting fee so the Internal Revenue Service would not flag the transaction during tax season. They knew. I stared at the glowing white screen as the devastating reality washed over me. They knew exactly what Brad was doing. They knew the luxury real estate business was a massive illegal Ponzi scheme. They knew they were actively spending stolen money that rightfully belonged to hardworking investors, local contractors, and innocent families who had trusted Brad with their life savings. Richard and Susan willingly participated in federal wire fraud because they were absolutely terrified of losing their fake elite status. They traded their own 22-year-old daughter for a shiny country club membership, and then they knowingly engaged in a criminal conspiracy to keep that membership active. They were perfectly happy to watch innocent people lose their retirements as long as they got to keep driving their leased Porsches, taking tropical vacations, and drinking expensive wine with their wealthy neighbors. The depth of their betrayal was staggering. The wound they inflicted when they kicked me out was deep, but this discovery was something entirely different. This was a confirmation that the people who brought me into the world were fundamentally corrupt. They lacked any basic moral compass. They worshipped money and status above all else, including their own flesh and blood, including the law, and including basic human decency. I read through dozens of similar emails. Emails where Susan complained about a contractor threatening to sue them for unpaid wages, and Richard advising Brad to simply bankrupt a shell company to wipe out the debt and leave the working man with absolutely nothing. They were ruthless. They played the role of upstanding, respectable suburban citizens while actively participating in the financial ruin of dozens of people. The 45 voicemails sitting on my phone suddenly made perfect sense. They were not crying because they felt remorse for what they had done to me. They were not panicked because they suddenly realized the error of their ways. They were terrified because the music had finally stopped playing. The legitimate money was completely gone. The new investors had stopped coming in. The massive commercial loans were in total default. The bank was not just asking for their money back. The bank was executing the cross-collateralization clause. The bank was coming for the house, the exact house they had so proudly kicked me out of 7 years ago. And they had absolutely no idea that the lead forensic auditor reviewing the final asset forfeiture documents, the partner holding the power to sign the execution order, was the very same daughter they had thrown away like garbage. I reached for my cold cup of coffee and took a slow sip. The storm outside was raging lightning, cracking aggressively across the dark Chicago sky. But inside my office, I had never felt more calm. I was looking at the absolute financial destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. But the audit file was not finished. There was one more section I needed to review, the most recent loan origination documents. I clicked on a folder labeled High-Risk Short-Term Credit Lines. As I began to scroll through the final desperate attempts Brad had made to secure cash, my eyes locked onto a signature block that made my blood run instantly cold. The betrayal I had just uncovered regarding my parents was horrific. But what Brad had done in the final weeks of his collapsing empire was a crime so personal, so deeply violating, that it elevated this from a standard corporate fraud case to an act of absolute war. I forced my hands to let go of the edge of my desk. The sheer weight of my parents' greed had settled heavily in my chest, but as a forensic accountant, I knew that taking a break was not an option. Fraud is a disease that spreads quickly through a system, and I needed to find every single infected cell. I closed the horrific internal email thread where my father and mother had casually discussed stealing investor money to pay for their country club fees. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the sterile, air-conditioned air of my Chicago office clear my head. The rain was still lashing violently against my floor-to-ceiling windows, washing over the city lights. Inside my office was completely silent, illuminated only by the harsh clinical glow of my dual computer monitors. I reached for my mouse and clicked into the next digital folder in the Federal Evidence Drive. This specific folder contained the loan origination documents from the final 3 months of Brad's failing business. These were the desperate, toxic commercial loans he had sought out when all the legitimate banks had completely cut him off. I opened the first PDF document. It was a massive, extremely high-risk corporate credit line from a predatory secondary lender. The interest rates attached to this specific loan were absolute financial suicide. Brad had leveraged everything he had left just to keep his fraudulent empire breathing for a few more weeks. I scrolled past the terrifying amortization schedules and moved directly to the bottom of the legal contract to verify the guarantor signatures. My eyes locked onto the digital signature block, and my heart began to pound a heavy, sickening rhythm against my ribs. Right next to my brother's flamboyant, overly stylized signature was a second name, Jessica Thomas, my sister-in-law. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes narrowing as I scrutinized the digital ink. Jessica was a sweet, incredibly trusting kindergarten teacher. She had married Brad right out of college, completely blinded by his confident charm and his fabricated wealth. She drove a modest sedan, worked long hours with her young students, and sincerely believed her husband was a hard-working real estate visionary. I knew for an absolute fact that Jessica had absolutely nothing to do with the daily operations of his corporate firm. She did not understand commercial finance, and she definitely would never have willingly co-signed a predatory business loan that made her personally liable for millions of dollars in toxic debt. I immediately pulled up the digital verification logs on my right monitor. Modern electronic signature software tracks everything. It logs the exact time a document is opened, the precise duration it is viewed, and the specific Internet Protocol address of the computer where the final signature is executed. I cross-referenced the IP address attached to Jessica's signature with the employee login records for Brad's company. The match was instantaneous and undeniable. The IP address belonged to Brad's private office computer. The timestamp showed the document was digitally signed at exactly 10:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. I checked my calendar. Jessica would have been standing in the middle of her elementary school classroom teaching reading comprehension to a room full of 5-year-olds at that exact moment. She was absolutely nowhere near a computer. Brad had blatantly forged his own wife's signature. A wave of pure disgust washed over me. Brad was not just stealing from wealthy anonymous investors or faceless commercial banks. He was actively destroying the financial future of the woman who shared his bed. By forging her name on these high-risk millions-of-dollar loans, Brad had secretly chained Jessica to a mountain of criminal debt. If the business went bankrupt, the predatory lenders would have full legal authorization to garnish her modest teaching wages, seize any future assets she might ever acquire, and completely ruin her credit for the rest of her life. He was throwing the mother of his future children directly under a speeding bus, just to buy himself a few more weeks of pretending to be a wealthy CEO. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. I rapidly clicked through the remaining loan documents in the folder. He had done it again and again. I found 5 separate commercial loan applications featuring Jessica's perfectly forged digital signature. He had turned his loving, unsuspecting wife into a financial human shield. My brother possessed absolutely zero morality. He viewed every single human being in his life as a disposable resource to be drained and discarded. I began typing a detailed forensic note for the federal investigators, thoroughly documenting the IP address mismatches and the timestamp discrepancies. I needed to ensure that Jessica would be legally protected from the inevitable financial fallout when the federal authorities finally raided his office. I was typing furiously when a sudden aggressive notification sound completely shattered the quiet of my office. A bright red security alert flashed violently across the center of my primary monitor. In forensic auditing software, a red flag alert is triggered when the system detects a highly anomalous or severely fraudulent transaction within the subject's financial network. My fingers froze above my keyboard. I dragged my mouse over the flashing red icon and clicked to expand the full security report. The report was generated directly from the Automated Fraud Detection Department of the Central Federal Banking Reserve. It detailed an aggressively flagged, automatically rejected credit application that had been submitted exactly 6 weeks ago. By that point in the timeline, Brad was completely out of options. His fake shell companies were collapsing. His parents' house was already fully leveraged. He had already forged his wife's name on every secondary loan he could find. He had bled every single stone completely dry. I read the details of the rejected application. Brad had attempted to open an unsecured business line of credit. The requested amount was staggering, $500,000. He was trying to secure $500,000 in pure cash to stop the bleeding. I scrolled down to read the personal identifying information of the primary applicant. I expected to see another forged document with Jessica's name. I expected to see my father's name or perhaps the name of an unsuspecting low-level employee at his firm. Instead, I stopped breathing. The name typed into the primary applicant box was Claire Thomas. The date of birth listed was my exact birthday. The current address provided was a fake postal box, but the previous residential address listed was the suburban house I had been kicked out of 7 years ago. And right below the address, entered into the federal banking portal with terrifying precision, was my exact 9-digit social security number. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the crime hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I sat completely paralyzed in my expensive executive chair, staring at my own name glowing back at me from the criminal ledger. My own brother had attempted to steal my identity. Brad had become so desperately backed into a corner by his own greed that he had decided to dig up the personal information of the younger sister his family had thrown away 7 years ago. He did not know that I had survived. He did not know that I had put myself through college, earned my CPA, and become a highly successful audit partner. As far as Brad knew, I was still a pathetic, struggling 22-year-old girl working a dead-end job at a greasy diner. He likely assumed I was living in a cheap, rundown apartment somewhere completely uneducated and financially illiterate. He assumed that I would be the absolute perfect victim. He figured he could easily use my clean, unused social security number to borrow $500,000 for his fake company. He planned to take the cash, let the loan go into catastrophic default, and leave me holding the bag. He was perfectly willing to completely destroy my entire financial future, leaving me with a $500,000 debt I could never possibly repay just to save his own skin. He viewed me as nothing more than a convenient, disposable piece of garbage, just like my parents did on that rainy night 7 years ago. But as I stared at the bright red rejected stamp on the digital application, a slow, deeply satisfying smile began to spread across my face. The shock slowly evaporated from my body, replaced by an overwhelming, powerful sense of absolute cosmic justice. Brad had made a fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated me for the very last time. My mind flashed back to the terrible freezing night I was kicked out of my childhood home. I remembered sitting on the sagging, moldy mattress in that cheap roadside motel, shivering in my soaked uniform. I remembered holding my $270 and realizing that I was entirely alone in the world. But I also remembered the very first action I took the following morning. When the sun came up, I walked 2 miles to the local public library. I paid $2 in loose change to rent a computer for an hour. I knew exactly who my family was. I knew my brother was a manipulative liar, and I knew my parents were financially reckless. I realized that morning that the only truly valuable asset I possessed in the entire world was my clean name and my pristine unused credit history. Sitting at that sticky library computer 7 years ago, I pulled up the websites for all 3 major national credit bureaus. I filled out the necessary forms, and I placed a hard permanent security freeze on my social security number. I locked down my identity with a strict specialized PIN code that only I knew. I mandated that absolutely no new lines of credit, no loans, and no financial accounts of any kind could ever be opened in my name without my direct physical voice authorization and the provision of that secret PIN code. I built an invisible, impenetrable fortress around my identity to ensure that my toxic family could never reach out and drag me down with them. I had completely forgotten about that security freeze as I built my successful career over the last 7 years, but the automated banking system had not forgotten. When Brad desperately typed my social security number into his office computer 6 weeks ago and confidently requested a $500,000 loan, he expected the money to flow easily into his fraudulent accounts. Instead, he slammed headfirst into the invisible brick wall I had built when I was just a terrified homeless girl. The banking system did not just casually reject his fraudulent application. Because my social security number carried a severe hard lock fraud warning, Brad's attempt triggered a massive, immediate, and high priority federal security alert. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as the brilliant, absolute perfection of the situation finally clicked into place. The irony was so poetic, so deeply beautiful, that I actually laughed out loud in my empty office. Brad's attempt to steal my identity was the exact fatal error that brought his entire empire crashing down. When the federal banking system flagged his fraudulent application, it did not just stop the $500,000 loan. The severe security alert automatically triggered a mandatory comprehensive review of the entire IP address and corporate network that had submitted the application. The banking regulators instantly pulled the files for his luxury real estate firm. They saw the massive, highly leveraged commercial loans. They saw the cross-collateralized suburban house belonging to Richard and Susan. They noticed the highly suspicious internal wire transfers and the drastically inflated property appraisals. Brad's single greedy attempt to destroy my life was the specific catalyst that completely exposed his massive Ponzi scheme to the federal government. The bank panicked. The regulators demanded an immediate, ruthless third-party forensic audit to determine exactly how much money had been stolen before they sent the FBI to make arrests. The bank needed the absolute best forensic accounting firm in Chicago to tear Brad's life apart and prepare the asset forfeiture documents. And that is exactly how the entire fraudulent file ended up sitting directly on my mahogany desk. Brad had tried to dig a grave for me, but he had accidentally triggered the avalanche that buried him alive. He had handed the executioner's sword directly to the exact person he thought he had thrown away. The 45 voicemails sitting on my personal phone were not just cries for help. They were the desperate sounds of a family realizing that they were completely trapped in a burning building, and they had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the only key to the exit. I picked up my cold coffee, took a long, victorious sip, and let the incredible reality of the moment wash over me. I had survived them. I had outsmarted them, and now I held their entire financial existence in the palm of my hand. Suddenly, the screen of my personal cell phone lit up again. The vibrating buzz echoed sharply across my quiet office. It was not another frantic voicemail. It was a new text message. I set my coffee down and picked up the phone. The message was from my mother, Susan. The tone of the message was so completely different from her previous sobbing voicemails that it made my skin crawl. The panic had vanished entirely, replaced by a sickeningly sweet, incredibly manipulative warmth. "Claire, my beautiful daughter," the text read. "We have missed you so incredibly much. It has been far too long since we have seen your face. Please come home for dinner this Saturday night. We made reservations at the new luxury steakhouse downtown. We just want to put the past behind us. We just want our family back together." I stared at the glowing text message, my thumbs hovering over the digital keyboard. The game was escalating, and the final act was about to begin. I stared at the glowing screen of my personal cell phone. The bright notification banner cut through the dim light of my office. It was a text message from my mother, Susan. Just an hour ago, she had been sobbing uncontrollably into my voicemail inbox, begging for me to save them because they were losing their suburban house. But this new text message was completely different. The frantic, terrified tone had entirely vanished. In its place was a sickeningly sweet, carefully crafted script of pure maternal warmth. I unlocked my phone and opened the message. "Claire, my beautiful daughter," the text read. "We have missed you so incredibly much. It has been far too long since we have seen your face. Please come home for dinner this Saturday night. We made reservations at the new luxury steakhouse downtown. We just want to put the past behind us. We just want our family back together." I read those words 4 times. Each time I read them, a cold, heavy knot twisted deeper into my stomach. My beautiful daughter. It was a phrase Susan had never once used when I lived under her roof. When I was a teenager, scrubbing grease off my diner uniform, she only called me ungrateful. When I was begging to keep my college scholarship, she called me a selfish traitor. Now suddenly, after 7 years of absolute punishing silence, I was her beautiful daughter. The raw pain of that realization hit me with unexpected force. Even after building an incredibly successful career, even after spending years in therapy. Healing from their abuse, there is still a small, fragile part of every estranged child that quietly hopes their parents will one day wake up and genuinely love them. You hope they will call you just to hear your voice. You hope they will reach out because they feel the deep, aching absence of their child in their lives. But reading Susan's text message completely extinguished that tiny, lingering spark of hope. Her love was entirely conditional. It was a transactional currency traded only when she needed to extract value from me. She did not miss her daughter. She missed her scapegoat. She missed the convenient workhorse she used to manipulate. The jarring contrast between her 45 panicked voicemails and this calm, loving text message was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The panic had not worked, so she was pivoting to the only other weapon she had left. She was trying to weaponize my own childhood trauma against me. She was dangling the one thing I had always desperately wanted, a happy, united family, right in front of my face. But my forensic accounting instincts quickly overrode my emotional response. The math simply did not add up. Narcissists do not experience miraculous moral epiphanies on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. They do not suddenly wake up and realize the massive error of their ways after a decade of cruelty. There is always a hidden catalyst. There is always a calculated angle. I set my phone face down on the desk. I placed both of my hands flat against the cool mahogany surface and took a deep, steadying breath. I shifted my attention away from the emotional pain and directed it entirely toward the cold, hard logic of my profession. Why today? Why the sudden shift from terror to a casual dinner invitation? I moved my mouse and opened a new tab on my web browser. I navigated to my professional network profile on LinkedIn. Because of my high-level position as a senior audit partner, my firm provides me with a premium account that tracks every single digital footprint on my page. If someone searches for my name, my current job title, or my corporate history, I receive an immediate and detailed report. I clicked on the notification icon in the top right corner of the screen. The page loaded slowly, displaying the list of professionals who had viewed my profile over the last 24 hours. Right at the very top of the list, viewed exactly 42 minutes ago, was a premium account registered to Bradley Thomas. The job title listed under his name was Chief Executive Officer at Apex Luxury Real Estate. I sat completely paralyzed in my chair. I stared at his smiling, professionally lit profile picture. The entire picture snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. They had not called me because they missed me. They had not called me because they regretted throwing me out into a freezing thunderstorm with $270 to my name. They called me because Brad's fraudulent empire was actively collapsing. And in a desperate blind panic, he had started researching the exact financial firm the federal banking regulators had hired to audit his criminal enterprise. He had gone online to investigate the executioners who were currently freezing his accounts. He searched the corporate directory for my firm, and right there, listed prominently as the lead partner of the forensic audit division, he saw my name. He saw my professional headshot. He saw the sister he had so easily discarded 7 years ago, sitting at the very top of the food chain, holding the absolute key to his financial destruction. Brad had immediately called my father crying. He had told Richard and Susan that the lead federal auditor preparing the asset forfeiture documents was Claire. The panic had rippled through the family, instantly resulting in the 45 desperate voicemails. But then they must have had a family meeting. They must have sat down in their cross-collateralized suburban house and devised a brand new strategy. I looked back down at the text message from my mother. The steakhouse invitation was not a peace offering. It was a highly calculated, carefully constructed trap. I began to unpack their exact psychological strategy. Brad, Richard, and Susan truly believed that I was still the exact same weak, desperate, 22-year-old girl they had abused for years. They assumed that because I was their daughter, I was still fundamentally desperate for their approval. They thought they could easily summon me to a fancy restaurant, buy me an expensive meal, and manipulate my emotions. They wanted to sit across from me at a high-end table, pour me a glass of expensive wine, and play the role of the loving, reunited family. They would smile, hold my hands, and tell me how incredibly proud they were of my success. They would offer fake, watered-down apologies for the past, claiming they were just trying to push me to be my best. And then right before the dessert arrived, the real conversation would begin. They would lean in close, lower their voices, and casually ask me to commit a major federal crime. They would expect me to use my high-level administrative clearance to log directly into the secure federal banking system. They would ask me to permanently delete the digital evidence of Brad's massive Ponzi scheme. They would demand that I erase the forged signatures of his innocent wife, Jessica, from the predatory loan applications. They would expect me to sign the official partner authorization to unfreeze their stolen assets and clear Brad's name completely. They believed they could buy my professional integrity, risk my entire career, and ask me to risk going to federal prison, all in exchange for a medium-rare steak and a fake hug from my mother. The absolute audacity of their plan was staggering. It took a special kind of sociopathic entitlement to throw a child onto the street, ignore her existence for 7 years, and then attempt to emotionally blackmail her into committing financial treason just to save the very people who ruined her life. They honestly thought I was stupid enough to fall for it. I pictured my brother sitting in his leased luxury car, frantically searching my name online, realizing that his little sister was the auditor sent to destroy him. I pictured Susan carefully typing out that sweet text message, confident that her words would instantly bring me running back to her like a trained dog. They were relying entirely on the powerful invisible chains of family loyalty. They were relying on the deeply ingrained societal belief that you must always protect your blood relatives, no matter how terribly they treat you. A heavy, dark anger began to boil in my chest. It was not the chaotic, tearful anger of my youth. It was a cold, sharp, focused rage. I had spent 7 years building an impeccable professional reputation. I had spent countless nights studying auditing, laws, ethics, and federal regulations. I had sworn a professional oath to uncover fraud and protect innocent people from predators exactly like my brother. If I accepted their invitation and attended that dinner without notifying the authorities, I would be violating my ethical duties. If I sat at that table and listened to them ask me to manipulate federal evidence, I could be charged as an accessory to their crimes. They were not just asking for a favor, they were actively trying to drag me down into the mud with them. They were trying to infect my clean, successful life with their toxic criminal corruption. My mother's text message was a blatant attempt at corporate extortion disguised poorly as maternal affection. I looked at the federal fraud file sitting on my mahogany desk. The documents were filled with the names of local contractors who had not been paid. Small business owners whose investments had been stolen to fund my parents' country club lifestyle. Jessica, a kindergarten teacher whose financial future was secretly destroyed by forged signatures. These were the real victims. These were the people I had sworn to protect. I picked up my cell phone. My fingers hovered over the digital keyboard. The easiest thing to do would be to block her number. I could simply ignore the text message, hand the audit file over to another senior partner in my firm due to a conflict of interest, and walk away entirely. I could let the federal banking regulators handle the arrests and the asset seizures without my direct involvement. I could remain completely invisible and let the justice system crush them. But as I looked at the words my beautiful daughter glowing on the screen, I knew that walking away in silence was no longer an option. If I walked away, they would never truly understand the magnitude of their actions. They would spend the rest of their lives believing that I was just a bitter, ungrateful child who got lucky in the corporate world. They needed to face the exact person they had tried to destroy. They needed to look across a dinner table and realize that the weak, desperate girl they threw away had grown up into the absolute architect of their downfall. I decided in that exact moment that I was going to accept their dinner invitation. I was going to walk into that luxury steakhouse wearing a designer suit bought with my own hard-earned money. I was going to sit down with the family that discarded me, and I was going to let them play their pathetic, manipulative games. I was going to let them offer their fake apologies and their toxic affection. I would let Brad lay out his entire criminal extortion plan right in front of my face. But this was not going to be a family reunion. This was going to be a controlled demolition. I would not go to that dinner as a daughter seeking love. I would go as a federal informant. I knew that the moment I agreed to meet with the subjects of an active federal fraud investigation, I had to immediately notify the authorities. I had to turn this pathetic attempt at emotional manipulation into a legally binding, completely undeniable trap. I stared at the text message one last time, feeling the final lingering threads of my childhood trauma completely snap and fade away. Susan was not my mother. Richard was not my father. Brad was not my brother. They were simply subjects in a massive commercial fraud case. They were targets. My thumbs moved deliberately across the screen as I drafted my reply to Susan. I kept my response incredibly brief, matching her fake warmth with a calculated performance of my own. I sent the message. That sounds lovely. I will see you all at the steakhouse this Saturday at 7. I locked the phone and placed it in my desk drawer. I immediately picked up my secure office phone and dialed the direct extension for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. I had a very important meeting to arrange, and I needed to ensure my family's dinner reservations included some highly specialized federal guests. I locked my phone and placed it inside my leather briefcase. The simple act of sending that text message, accepting my mother's dinner invitation, felt like crossing a massive, irreversible threshold. I did not feel any lingering sadness. I did not feel the suffocating anxiety that used to paralyze me whenever Richard or Susan raised their voices. Instead, a cold, resolute fury settled deep into my bones. It was a completely clinical anger. It was the absolute certainty of a woman who finally held all the cards and knew exactly how to play them. I stood up from my heavy mahogany desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window of my office. The Chicago skyline was obscured by the relentless driving rain. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I was not the terrified 22-year-old girl sitting on a sagging motel bed with $270 to her name. I was 29 years old. I was a senior audit partner. I wore a tailored wool suit, and I commanded a team of highly specialized financial investigators. My parents had thrown me out into a storm because they firmly believed I was entirely powerless. They were about to discover exactly how much power I had accumulated in the dark. I turned away from the window and immediately began compiling the digital evidence. I took the master audit file, the forged commercial loan applications, the hidden internal emails between Brad and my parents, and the rejected credit application containing my stolen social security number. I copied every single document onto an encrypted, secure flash drive. I placed the flash drive into a red legal folder. I grabbed my trench coat, turned off the lights in my office, and walked out to the elevator. The drive through the slick, rain-soaked streets of downtown Chicago took exactly 20 minutes. The tires of my car hissed against the wet pavement. My mind was completely clear. I was mapping out the exact legal boundaries of what I was about to do. In the world of forensic accounting, ethics are absolutely paramount. A licensed auditor cannot legally lead a federal financial investigation into her own immediate family members. It is a massive, undeniable conflict of interest. If I simply continued auditing Brad's company and submitted the final asset forfeiture reports without disclosing our biological relationship, a smart defense attorney could easily argue that the entire investigation was biased. They could claim I fabricated the evidence out of personal revenge. They could get the entire federal case thrown out of court on a technicality. I was absolutely not going to let Brad escape federal prison on a technicality. I pulled my car into the heavily secured underground parking garage of the federal building. I passed through the metal detectors, showed my professional identification to the armed security guards, and took the elevator up to the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had been working closely with this specific field office for the past 3 weeks regarding Brad's commercial real estate fraud. The lead investigator on the case was Special Agent David Miller. He was a veteran federal agent, a tall, no-nonsense man in his early 50s who had spent his entire career dismantling organized financial crime rings. He trusted my firm implicitly, and he respected my auditing work. I walked directly into Agent Miller's office and closed the heavy wooden door firmly behind me. He looked up from his desk, slightly surprised by my unscheduled late afternoon arrival. I sat down in the chair across from him and placed the red legal folder flat on his desk. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that I had to formally and immediately recuse myself as the lead forensic auditor on the Apex luxury real estate investigation. Agent Miller frowned deeply. He asked me what was going on, reminding me that my team had practically handed the government a perfect, airtight criminal case. He said they were only a few days away from finalizing the arrest warrants. I opened the red folder and slid the encrypted flash drive across the desk. I kept my voice perfectly level. I explained that the chief executive officer of the fraudulent company, Bradley Thomas, was my biological brother. I explained that the primary financial co-signers on the toxic commercial loans, Richard and Susan Thomas, were my biological parents. I watched Agent Miller's expression shift from professional confusion to absolute stunned silence. I did not stop there. I explained that I had been completely estranged from them for 7 years. I detailed how Brad had forged his wife Jessica's signature on multiple high-risk loan documents to secretly absorb his debt. Finally, I placed a printed copy of the rejected bank application on the desk. I pointed directly to my own social security number printed on the page. I told Agent Miller that my brother had become so desperate for cash that he attempted to steal my identity to open a $500,000 credit line. Agent Miller leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He stared at the documents processing the massive twisted web of family betrayal I had just laid out in front of him. He told me that my recusal was absolutely the right legal move to protect the integrity of the federal indictment. He assured me that his team would immediately transfer the final auditing review to another senior partner at my firm. The criminal case would proceed without delay. Then I pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen, opened the text message thread from my mother, and placed the phone on the desk right next to the flash drive. I told Agent Miller that an hour ago, my mother had left me multiple panicked voicemails screaming that they were losing their house. I explained that when the panic did not work, she completely changed her strategy and sent me a sweet manipulative text message inviting me to a luxury steakhouse this coming Saturday night for a supposed family reunion. I told him about my LinkedIn notifications. I explained that Brad knew exactly who I was and what position I held at the auditing firm handling their case. Agent Miller read the text message. He looked back up at me, his eyes narrowing with sharp professional realization. He knew exactly what I was implying. I told him that they were not inviting me to dinner to apologize. They were inviting me to dinner to extort me. They fully intended to use our biological relationship to emotionally blackmail me into accessing the federal banking portal. They were going to ask me to permanently delete the evidence of their massive Ponzi scheme and authorize the release of their frozen bank accounts. Agent Miller sat forward, resting his forearms on the desk. He asked me what I wanted to do about the dinner invitation. I told him that I had already accepted it. I offered myself to the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a cooperating undercover witness. I volunteered to walk into that high-end steakhouse, sit down with the people who had abused and discarded me, and let them play their entire hand. I offered to wear a concealed recording device and capture Brad, Richard, and Susan actively attempting to extort a federal auditor and tamper with a major federal fraud investigation. Agent Miller did not hesitate. He recognized the absolute goldmine of criminal evidence I was handing him. Capturing the primary suspects, actively attempting to destroy federal documents, and blackmail a financial investigator would elevate the charges from basic commercial mortgage fraud to felony witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and criminal conspiracy. It would guarantee that Brad would not just face fines, but he would face a mandatory lengthy sentence in federal prison. For the next 2 hours, the white-collar crime division moved with aggressive, coordinated precision. Agent Miller brought in a team of specialized federal prosecutors to draft the necessary undercover consent forms. I signed every single document without a flinch. I was no longer the frightened girl crying on a dark suburban street. I was an authorized agent of their destruction working directly alongside the federal government. The following 2 days were a blur of intense, highly classified preparation. I officially handed my master audit files over to a trusted senior colleague at my firm. I briefed him on the exact locations of the forged signatures and the fake shell companies, ensuring the transition was completely seamless. The bank executives who had originally hired my firm were furious when they realized the sheer magnitude of Brad's deception. When the bank's legal department saw the undeniable proof that Brad, Richard, and Susan had knowingly conspired to commit wire fraud using stolen investor capital, they completely abandoned any remaining professional courtesy. The bank's aggressive legal team immediately drafted the final brutal foreclosure documents for my parents' house. Because Richard and Susan had willingly used their paid-off suburban home as cross-collateral for Brad's junk loans, the bank had the absolute legal right to seize the property the moment the loans went into catastrophic default. The bank also drafted emergency asset forfeiture orders to permanently seize the fleet of leased Porsche SUVs and drain their personal checking accounts to recover the stolen money. The trap was being perfectly set. Every single exit door was being permanently locked and bolted shut. On Saturday evening, 3 hours before the scheduled dinner, I drove back to the federal building. The storm from earlier in the week had finally cleared, leaving the evening air sharp, crisp, and bitterly cold. I parked my car and walked into a secure briefing room located in the basement of the FBI field office. Agent Miller was waiting for me along with two specialized technical technicians. I was wearing a highly structured, incredibly sharp designer suit in a deep, powerful shade of navy blue. It was a suit that projected absolute authority. I wanted my family to see exactly how much success I had built without them. I wanted them to look across the table and realize they were no longer dealing with a helpless child. The technicians asked me to step behind a privacy screen. They carefully taped a small, highly sensitive audio transmitter directly to my skin, hiding the exceptionally thin microphone discreetly beneath the lapel of my silk blouse. They ran the wires smoothly along my ribcage, securing the tiny battery pack at the small of my back. It felt strange against my skin. It felt heavy, a physical reminder of the massive legal weight I was carrying into that restaurant. Agent Miller gave me my final tactical briefing. He told me to stay perfectly calm. He instructed me to let them do all the talking. He said I needed to let Brad explicitly lay out his demands on the recording. I needed to wait for them to specifically ask me to alter the federal audit files or offer me a bribe. He told me that once I had the clear, undeniable extortion demand on tape, I simply needed to use a pre-arranged safe phrase. The phrase was simple. Did you get all that? Agent Miller explained that he and another undercover federal agent would be sitting in a booth directly adjacent to our table in the steakhouse. They would be listening to the live audio feed in real time. The moment I spoke the safe phrase, they would stand up, show their badges, and execute the arrest warrants immediately on the spot. I looked at Agent Miller and nodded my head. I told him I understood the plan perfectly. I left the federal building and drove my car toward the luxury steakhouse located in the heart of downtown Chicago. The streets were glowing with bright city lights, reflecting off the damp pavement. My hands were resting lightly on the steering wheel. My heart was beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. I thought about the last time I had seen my parents. I thought about the 3 black garbage bags sitting on the wet porch. I thought about the heavy wooden door slamming shut in my face, locking me out in the freezing rain. I thought about my father looking at me with pure disgust, telling me I was worthless because I would not sacrifice my education to buy my brother a fake business empire. They had tried to bury me. They had tried to erase me completely from the world. But a seed does not die when it is buried in the dark. It grows. It builds roots. It breaks through the concrete. I pulled my car up to the valet stand in front of the brilliantly lit, incredibly expensive steakhouse. I handed my keys to the attendant and tipped him $20. I smoothed the lapels of my navy blue designer suit, feeling the hard, reassuring edge of the federal microphone hidden beneath the expensive silk fabric. I took one final deep breath of the cold Chicago air. My brother, my father, and my mother were currently sitting inside that restaurant, pouring expensive wine, totally convinced that they were about to manipulate a naive, desperate daughter into saving them from federal prison. They were absolutely certain that their blood relation gave them complete immunity from the consequences of their horrific actions. They had absolutely no idea that they were currently sitting inside a carefully constructed federal cage, and I was holding the only match. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and walked inside. The final act was ready to begin. The rain had finally stopped by the time I pulled my car up to the valet stand of the legendary steakhouse in the heart of downtown Chicago. It was the kind of notoriously expensive establishment where corporate titans and wealthy politicians routinely close multi-million-dollar deals over dry-aged ribeyes and imported scotch. The heavy glass doors opened, and the air inside immediately hit me with the rich, intoxicating scent of roasted garlic, burning oak wood, and old money. The lighting in the main dining room was deliberately low and moody, casting warm golden shadows across the heavy mahogany tables and deep burgundy leather booths. I arrived exactly 20 minutes early. I wanted to establish my physical presence in the room before my family even walked through the door. I wanted them to walk into my territory. The hostess directed me to a private, semi-secluded booth located near the very back of the restaurant. I specifically chose to sit on the side of the booth facing the main entrance. The hidden federal microphone taped securely to my ribs felt like a solid shield of armor against my skin. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy blue suit. It was crafted from imported Italian wool, and it fit me with absolute undeniable perfection. It was the exact kind of garment that projected a silent, lethal authority. I ordered a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lemon, folded my hands neatly on the table, and simply waited. Through the massive front windows of the restaurant, I watched a sleek black Porsche SUV pull aggressively into the valet loading zone. My pulse remained perfectly steady. The valet opened the doors, and out stepped my biological family. Brad emerged first from the driver's seat. He wore a custom gray suit that was clearly meant to make him look like a powerful, successful executive. But from my vantage point across the restaurant, I could see exactly how tightly the fabric pulled across his rigid shoulders. He looked incredibly tense. Richard and Susan stepped out of the passenger doors next. My father wore his absolute best country club blazer. My mother was tightly wrapped in an expensive cashmere coat, carrying a designer handbag that I knew for a documented forensic fact was purchased with stolen investor funds. They stood on the wet sidewalk for a brief moment, whispering urgently to one another. They were getting their story straight. They were desperately rehearsing their lines for the performance of a lifetime. Then I watched them plaster huge, completely fabricated smiles across their faces as they confidently walked through the heavy glass doors. The hostess led them through the crowded dining room toward my booth. As soon as Susan laid eyes on me, she let out a loud, dramatic gasp. She rushed forward, throwing her arms open wide entirely, ignoring the wealthy patrons dining quietly at the tables around us. She wrapped her arms tightly around my neck and pulled me into a suffocating, perfume-heavy hug. She pressed her face against my shoulder and actually began to cry. They were not quiet, subtle tears. They were loud, highly performative sobs, specifically designed to show everyone in the restaurant what a deeply loving, emotional mother she was. "Oh, my beautiful Claire," Susan cried, squeezing my shoulders tighter. "Look at you, just look at you. I have missed you so incredibly much. My heart has just been aching for my only daughter." I sat perfectly rigid in the booth. I did not raise my arms to hug her back. I simply let her perform her ridiculous charade. The sheer cognitive dissonance of the moment was genuinely breathtaking. This was the exact same woman who had packed my childhood belongings into plastic garbage bags and watched me walk into a freezing thunderstorm with $270 to my name. She had not shed a single tear on that terrible night. Now she was weeping over my expensive wool suit like a grieving mother miraculously reunited with her lost child. Richard stepped forward next. He placed a heavy paternal hand on my shoulder and gave it a firm, affectionate squeeze. He looked down at me with a perfectly manufactured expression of deep paternal pride. "Claire," he said, his voice thick with fake emotion, "you look absolutely incredible. We are so incredibly proud of the brilliant woman you have become. It has been far too long since we have been together." Finally, Brad slid into the leather booth directly across from me. He flashed his signature, highly arrogant smile. It was the exact same smile that had successfully charmed innocent investors out of their entire life savings. "Hey, little sister," he said casually, acting as if we had just seen each other last weekend at a casual family barbecue. "It is really great to see you doing so well. I love the suit. It looks like you finally moved up in the world." The waiter arrived promptly to hand out the heavy leather-bound menus and take our drink orders. This is where the absolute absurdity of their psychological manipulation truly began to shine. Despite the undeniable fact that they were facing catastrophic financial ruin, and despite the fact that the federal government was actively preparing to freeze all of their bank accounts, they immediately tried to aggressively flex their fake wealth. They desperately needed to prove to me that they were still the elite powerful superiors in this family dynamic. Brad confidently ordered a bottle of incredibly expensive vintage Cabernet Sauvignon without even glancing at the price tag. Richard ordered a massive plate of imported oysters for the table. Susan waved her hand dismissively at the waiter, requesting a very specific high-end brand of sparkling water. They were playing the role of wealthy, unbothered suburban royalty to absolute perfection. If I had not personally reviewed the forensic audit files, proving that their entire net worth was a criminal illusion, I might have actually believed the performance. For the first 45 minutes of the dinner, they did not mention the 45 panicked voicemails they had frantically left on my phone. They completely ignored the fact that they were absolutely terrified of going to federal prison. Instead, they spun a massive glittering web of absolute lies. Susan dominated the conversation. She chattered endlessly about the trivial, meaningless drama at their exclusive country club. She complained bitterly about the poor quality of the new landscaping company hired to maintain the golf course. She talked about her recent shopping trips to luxury boutiques and the incredibly expensive renovations they were allegedly planning for the kitchen of their suburban home. She was talking excitedly about renovating the exact same home that the bank was actively preparing to foreclose on and physically seize before the end of the week. I sat quietly, eating my crisp wedge salad, nodding politely at the appropriate intervals. I was using my years of forensic auditing training to observe every single micro-expression, every tiny crack in their carefully constructed armor. The physical signs of massive psychological stress were everywhere, if you knew exactly what to look for. Brad was drinking his expensive red wine far too quickly. He finished 2 full glasses before the main courses even arrived at the table. His right leg was bouncing nervously under the heavy wooden table, vibrating constantly with suppressed, terrified anxiety. A thin sheen of nervous sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. Richard kept checking his expensive gold watch, his eyes darting anxiously toward the restaurant entrance every single time the heavy doors opened. He looked exactly like a guilty man waiting for a bomb to finally detonate. Susan was gripping her heavy crystal wine glass so tightly that her knuckles were turning completely white under the restaurant lights. Her voice was just a fraction too loud, and her pitch was just slightly too high. She was physically straining to maintain the fragile illusion of absolute perfection. They were sweating. They were bleeding out financially and legally, yet they sat directly across from me, bragging loudly about their imaginary wealth. It was a fascinating, utterly horrifying display of narcissistic delusion. They truly believed that if they just pretended everything was perfectly fine, they could eventually manipulate me into doing whatever they demanded. They thought they were strategically softening me up with expensive food and fake family bonding. They assumed I was still the desperate, approval-starved 22-year-old girl they had thrown away like garbage. When the waiter returned with our main courses, the theatrical performance escalated even further. Brad had deliberately ordered the most expensive dry-aged tomahawk steak on the menu. He sliced into the thick meat with a deeply smug expression, actively trying to look like a wildly successful chief executive officer. "You know, Claire," Brad said, pointing his silver fork directly at me, "I always knew you would eventually land on your feet. You were always a very hard worker. But I have to admit, seeing you as a senior partner at a top-tier financial firm is pretty impressive. We should really talk about your portfolio sometime soon. I could give you some great investment tips. The commercial real estate market is absolutely booming right now." I looked at my brother, the man who had ruthlessly forged his own wife's signature to secretly absorb his toxic commercial debt. The man who had desperately tried to steal my social security number just 6 weeks ago to open a $500,000 credit line. He was sitting across from me, casually offering me financial advice. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of his statement almost made me laugh out loud right there in the dining room. Richard immediately jumped into the conversation, eager to aggressively support his golden son. "Your brother is doing incredibly well, Claire," my father said, taking a slow sip of his expensive wine. "His firm is expanding very rapidly. He's handling some massive commercial developments downtown. We always knew he had a brilliant mind for business. The entire family is just so incredibly proud of his massive success." Susan reached across the mahogany table and tried to touch my hand again. I subtly pulled my hand back, resting it safely and securely in my lap. She pretended not to notice the cold rejection. She just smiled, her bright, completely empty smile. "We really want you to be part of all this success," Claire, Susan said, softly tilting her head with fake sympathy. "We know the past was a little rocky between us. Families have silly disagreements. People say things they do not really mean when tensions are high. But we are blood. Blood is the absolute most important thing in the entire world. We want you back in our lives. We want to celebrate all these wonderful achievements together as a united family." I continued to eat my meal in perfect, terrifying silence. I chewed my food slowly. I took a deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I let the silence stretch out incredibly far across the table. I let the quiet grow heavy, dark, and deeply uncomfortable. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were laying down the emotional foundation. They were frantically trying to build a bridge of fake love and fake success so they could eventually walk casually across it and ask me to commit a major federal crime. They were waiting for me to melt. They were waiting for me to cry, to apologize for being estranged for 7 years, and to eagerly accept their pathetic crumbs of affection. But the silence was beginning to deeply unnerve them. My complete lack of emotional reaction was completely throwing off their carefully rehearsed script. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his leather booth, wiping his sweating forehead with his napkin. Richard cleared his throat repeatedly, looking down at his plate. Susan's bright smile began to look severely strained and incredibly brittle, like old glass, ready to violently shatter into 1,000 pieces. The waiters soon arrived to clear our dinner plates. They had ordered dessert, a massive decadent slice of chocolate cake to share among the table. The waiter placed it directly in the center of the mahogany wood and poured fresh cups of steaming dark coffee. The dinner was rapidly wrapping up. They had completely run out of fake country club gossip. They had run out of fake brags about their imaginary real estate empire. The time for pleasantries was officially over. The giant suffocating elephant in the room was growing entirely too large to ignore. They needed to make their actual demand. They needed to ask me to illegally access the highly secure federal auditing portal and permanently delete the devastating evidence of their massive commercial mortgage fraud. They needed me to authorize the unfreezing of their stolen bank accounts before the federal authorities showed up at their front door with arrest warrants. But they simply did not know how to bridge the massive gap between their fake, boastful stories and the terrifying reality of their imminent incarceration. I decided it was finally time to put them out of their absolute misery. I picked up my white linen napkin and carefully, methodically dabbed the corners of my mouth. I folded the napkin into a perfectly neat square and placed it gently on the table next to my coffee cup. I rested my forearms squarely on the heavy mahogany wood. As I leaned forward, I felt the cold, hard plastic edge of the federal recording device pressing firmly against my ribs beneath my suit jacket. I looked directly across the table. I did not look at Susan. I did not look at Brad. I locked my eyes entirely on Richard, the patriarch of the family, the man who had stood on a wet concrete porch 7 years ago and told me I was completely worthless because I refused to be a financial slave to his favorite child. The restaurant around us was still bustling loudly with the sounds of wealthy patrons laughing and clinking expensive crystal glasses. But at our specific table, the air had grown completely still and freezing cold. The fake plastic smiles had melted away entirely. They could feel the sudden massive shift in the atmosphere. They realized in that exact fraction of a second that they were absolutely not in control of this conversation. I stared deeply into my father's eyes, watching the sudden realization of terror begin to form in his pupils. I kept my voice incredibly soft, perfectly calm, and absolutely lethal. So I said, leaning forward just an inch closer, "I hear you are losing the house." The moment the words left my mouth, the entire atmosphere at our table collapsed inward. I had just softly dropped the reality of their foreclosure right into the center of their expensive dinner. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The thick manufactured masks of suburban perfection they had been wearing all evening did not just slip. They shattered completely. My father stopped breathing. His hand, which had been reaching for his crystal wine glass, froze in midair. The color drained from his face so rapidly that his skin took on a sickening ashen gray tone under the warm restaurant lights. Brad sat completely paralyzed, his jaw tight, his arrogant smirk entirely wiped away. But it was my mother Susan who reacted first. The saccharine sweetness she had been pouring over me vanished. Her eyes hardened into two dark, furious points. The loving, tearful mother from 10 minutes ago was gone. In her place sat the exact same woman who had coldly ordered me out of her house 7 years ago. Her voice dropped to a vicious, venomous whisper. She leaned across the mahogany table, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the wood like claws. She told me to lower my voice immediately. She hissed that I had absolutely no right to speak to my father that way. She said they had not invited me to this luxury steakhouse to be insulted by an ungrateful, arrogant child who had simply gotten lucky in the corporate world. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of the federal microphone taped securely against my ribs. I knew that every single word she was saying was currently being transmitted directly to the federal agents sitting in the adjacent booth. I maintained steady eye contact with her, offering absolutely zero emotional response. My silence only fueled her desperate anger. Susan told me that the family was facing a temporary cash flow issue. She completely minimized the massive multi-million-dollar federal fraud investigation. She called it a simple misunderstanding with the banking regulators. Then she launched into the exact manipulation I had anticipated. She told me that she knew exactly what position I held at my financial firm. She knew I was the lead audit partner handling Brad's commercial real estate file. She said it was a miracle, a sign from the universe, that her own daughter was the one in charge of the investigation. She leaned even closer, the smell of her expensive perfume suffocating the space between us. She told me that I owed this family. She claimed that they had raised me, sheltered me, and sacrificed for me. She entirely glossed over the fact that they had abandoned me on a freezing street. Susan demanded that I use my high-level administrative clearance tomorrow morning. She ordered me to log into the secure federal banking portal and completely wipe Brad's financial audit clean. She demanded that I delete the flagging codes, unfreeze their corporate and personal checking accounts, and issue a formal partner authorization declaring that Apex Luxury Real Estate was completely clear of any financial wrongdoing. She said I owed them my loyalty. She told me that blood is thicker than any corporate policy. If I did this small favor for them, she promised they would welcome me back into the family with open arms. They would let me attend their country club events. They would finally be proud of me. I looked at her, feeling a cold, resolute fury settling into my bones. The sheer entitlement was staggering. She was actively ordering me to commit federal financial treason, risking decades in federal prison, and she was offering me a fake toxic family relationship as my reward. I reached down to the floor beside my booth. I unzipped my heavy leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick red legal folder containing the redacted copies of the forensic audit I had prepared earlier that afternoon. I lifted the folder and dropped it squarely onto the center of the table. The heavy folder landed with a loud, definitive thud that echoed sharply over the sounds of the surrounding diners. Brad flinched violently at the sound. My father stared at the red folder as if it were an explosive device. I looked my father directly in the eye. I told him that I was not a naive 22-year-old girl anymore. I told him I was a senior forensic auditor and I knew absolutely everything. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with an absolute lethal clarity that commanded the entire table. I tapped the top of the red folder. I told him that the file contained the complete unredacted transaction logs of their massive Ponzi scheme. I detailed exactly how Brad had routinely stolen millions of dollars from honest, hardworking investors. I explained how he had diverted construction funds into dummy shell companies. I looked at my mother and specifically mentioned the $200,000 initiation fee for her exclusive country club. I mentioned the fleet of leased Porsche SUVs. I told them that the expensive dry-aged steak they were currently eating was paid for with stolen money that rightfully belonged to innocent families. My father opened his mouth to protest, but I immediately cut him off. I was not finished. I had to get all the crimes on the federal audio recording. I turned my attention to Brad. My brother was sweating profusely now, his eyes darting frantically around the restaurant. I leaned forward and told him that the simple wire fraud was not even the worst part of the audit. I told him I had found the high-risk secondary commercial loans. I watched his throat swallow hard. I stated clearly for the hidden microphone to capture that I possessed undeniable digital proof that he had explicitly forged the signature of his own wife. I told the table that Brad had secretly chained Jessica to millions of dollars in highly toxic, predatory corporate debt. I explained that while Jessica was teaching kindergarten, Brad was actively destroying her financial future to buy himself a few more weeks of fake luxury. Susan gasped, genuinely shocked by that specific revelation. She looked at Brad with wide eyes. Even she did not know the absolute depths of his depravity. Richard looked visibly shaken, but he remained silent, staring at the red folder. Then I delivered the final, ultimate blow. I told Brad that I had reviewed the rejected application for the $500,000 unsecured business credit line from 6 weeks ago. I watched his face turn from red to a terrifying pale white. I told him that I knew he had used my previous residential address. I told him I knew he had used my exact date of birth. And I told him I had the digital timestamp proving that he had entered my exact 9-digit social security number into a federal banking portal in a desperate attempt to steal my identity. I explained the beautiful poetic irony of his failure. I told him that the only reason he did not get that $500,000 was because I had placed a permanent hard security freeze on my identity the exact same night they kicked me out of the house 7 years ago. I told him that his greedy attempt to ruin my financial life was the exact trigger that alerted the federal banking regulators to his massive fraud. His attempt to steal my name was the specific action that placed his criminal audit file directly onto my desk. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute and total. The restaurant around us continued to hum with normal evening conversation, but our table was trapped in a vacuum of sheer terror. They were completely cornered. Every single lie, every manipulation, and every horrific crime had been dragged out into the harsh light of reality. Suddenly, my father erupted. Richard slammed his heavy fist violently onto the mahogany table. The crystal wine glasses rattled loudly against the wood. The silverware clattered against the porcelain plates. Several patrons at nearby tables turned their heads to look at us, startled by the aggressive noise. My father's face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He did not show a single ounce of remorse for the stolen money. He did not care about the innocent investors whose retirements had been destroyed. He certainly did not care about the fact that his son had attempted to steal my identity. His only concern was protecting his own selfish interests and defending his favored golden child. Richard leaned across the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He told me that I was a bitter, vindictive child who was intentionally trying to ruin her own family out of spite. He claimed that Brad was a brilliant visionary who was simply going through a tough market cycle. He shouted that the investors knew the risks when they handed over their money. He blamed the federal government. He blamed the banking regulations. He blamed everyone in the world except the people sitting at that table. He demanded that I fix the situation immediately. He told me that if I had any shred of decency left in my soul, I would take that red folder, march back to my office, and permanently destroy the evidence. He said that a good daughter would gladly sacrifice her career to save her father from losing his home. It was the exact same abusive language he had used 7 years ago. He was demanding my total sacrifice to subsidize their toxic entitlement. But before Richard could continue his tirade, Brad raised his hand and strictly cut our father off. Brad had stopped sweating. The sheer panic that had gripped him just moments before had morphed into something entirely different. He settled back into the deep leather booth and slowly adjusted the cuffs of his expensive gray suit. A cold, highly calculated sneer spread across his face. He looked at me with the eyes of a predator who firmly believed he had suddenly found the ultimate leverage. Brad reached inside the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp, folded piece of thick legal paper. He placed it on the table right next to my red audit folder. He pressed his fingers flat against the paper and slowly slid it across the mahogany wood until it rested directly in front of my plate. I looked down at the document. It was a pre-written, legally formatted corporate exoneration form. It was officially drafted on my financial auditing firm's letterhead. The document explicitly stated that a thorough, comprehensive forensic review had been conducted on Apex Luxury Real Estate. It declared that absolutely zero evidence of financial misconduct, wire fraud, or misappropriation of funds had been discovered. It certified that all commercial loan documents were legitimate and properly executed. At the very bottom of the page, there was a blank signature line waiting for the lead senior audit partner. My signature. Brad looked me dead in the eye. He told me that I was going to sign that document right now using the expensive pen he was pulling from his pocket. He told me I was going to take that signed exoneration form back to the federal banking regulators on Monday morning and formally close the investigation. I stared at him, keeping my expression perfectly blank. I asked him why I would ever do something that would instantly destroy my career and make me an accessory to federal fraud. Brad leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He smiled his arrogant, completely hollow smile. He was about to close his own trap directly around his own neck, and he had absolutely no idea. He lowered his voice, delivering his threat with cold, deliberate precision. He explicitly laid out his blackmail strategy, detailing his own crimes on the hidden federal microphone while actively attempting to extort a cooperating government informant. Brad told me that if I did not sign the exoneration document tonight, he would completely destroy me. He said he had already contacted a ruthless corporate defense attorney. He told me that if the federal indictments were issued, he would immediately go to the major financial press. He would contact the board of directors at my auditing firm. He explained exactly how he would spin the narrative. He would publicly revealed that the lead forensic auditor investigating his company was his estranged, deeply bitter biological sister. He would provide the media with the tragic story of how I was kicked out of the family years ago. He would claim that I had harbored an intense psychotic grudge for 7 years. Brad told me word for exact word that he would accuse me of orchestrating the entire fraud investigation to frame him. He would tell the federal judge that I deliberately fabricated the evidence, altered the digital transaction logs, and falsified the predatory loan documents specifically to ruin his successful business out of pure jealousy. He threatened to claim that I had personally hacked into his secure servers to plant my own social security number on that rejected credit application just to manufacture an identity theft charge against him. He smirked, looking incredibly proud of his twisted sociopathic logic. He told me that even if the federal prosecutors did not entirely believe his story, the massive scandal and the blatant conflict of interest would force my auditing firm to instantly terminate my employment. He promised me that the resulting media circus would ensure that I would never ever work in the financial sector again. My pristine reputation would be completely pulverized. Brad tapped the blank signature line on the exoneration document. He told me I had a very simple choice. I could sign the paper, save my family, and keep my lucrative career intact. Or I could refuse, and he would drag me down into the absolute depths of hell right alongside him. He told me that he was willing to burn the entire world to the ground to avoid going to federal prison. Richard nodded in aggressive agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. Susan watched me with cold, calculating eyes, waiting for me to surrender. They sat there in the expensive downtown steakhouse, completely united in their toxic criminal extortion. They believed they had perfectly backed me into a corner. They believed I had absolutely no escape route. I looked down at the exoneration document. Then I looked back up at my brother. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidation. I felt the profound, overwhelming satisfaction of a hunter watching their prey walk willingly into the center of the cage and pull the door completely shut. Brad had just explicitly admitted to his financial crimes, admitted to knowing about the identity theft, and actively threatened to commit perjury and frame a federal investigator, all while demanding I commit obstruction of justice. It was a flawless, undeniable confession recorded in perfectly clear, high-definition audio by the United States government. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen Brad had placed on the table. I held it in my hand for a moment, letting them believe they had won. I saw the arrogant relief wash over my brother's face. I saw my mother let out a long, dramatic sigh. I placed the pen down on the table right next to the unsigned document. I sat back in my leather booth, adjusting my suit jacket. I looked directly at Brad and I spoke the exact predetermined safe phrase in a clear, resonant voice. "Did you get all that?" For a fraction of a second, Brad looked incredibly confused. He frowned, opening his mouth to ask what I meant. He never got the chance to speak. The sudden explosive movement in the booth directly adjacent to ours instantly shattered the quiet tension of the dining room. 2 tall men in dark suits stood up simultaneously. They did not look like wealthy steakhouse patrons anymore. They moved with absolute terrifying tactical precision. Special Agent David Miller stepped directly up to our mahogany table. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a gold federal badge, holding it up so the gleaming metal caught the restaurant lights perfectly. The absolute paralyzing horror that ripped across the faces of my family in that exact moment is an image that will remain burned into my memory for the rest of my life. I stared down at the heavy silver pen resting on the polished mahogany table. Right beside it lay the flawlessly printed exoneration document. The crisp white paper was a physical manifestation of every lie my family had ever told. It was a loaded gun handed directly to me by the very people who had spent my entire life treating me like collateral damage. The restaurant around us continued its low hum of clinking crystal and wealthy laughter. Nobody else in the dining room had any idea that a massive criminal conspiracy was actively unfolding right next to their expensive steaks. Brad leaned back against the deep burgundy leather of our booth. He had perfectly arranged his features into a mask of complete and utter victory. He truly believed he had me completely cornered. He had just laid out his entire extortion plan in excruciating detail. He had explicitly threatened to destroy my career, manipulate the federal courts, and ruin my reputation forever if I did not sign my name on that blank line. He thought his blackmail was an absolute masterpiece of psychological warfare. I looked at my father, Richard. He was nodding slowly, a tight approving smile forming on his face. He was incredibly proud of his son in that moment. He was proud of the ruthless, sociopathic manipulation Brad was wielding against his own sister. Then I looked at my mother, Susan. She was literally holding her breath, her manicured hands clasped together in fake prayer, waiting for me to surrender. They had spent my entire childhood breaking my spirit, and they were completely confident that my spirit was still broken. They thought the terrified 22-year-old girl they had kicked out into a freezing thunderstorm was still living inside my mind. They thought they could still command my obedience through sheer intimidation, but they did not understand the woman sitting across from them. They did not understand that I had spent the last 7 years rebuilding my soul from absolute scratch. I had spent countless nights studying financial law, understanding corporate fraud, and learning exactly how to dismantle criminals just like the man sitting across from me. I was not their victim anymore. I was a senior forensic audit partner, and I was holding the absolute power over their entire existence. I slowly reached out my right hand. I extended my fingers toward the heavy silver pen. As my skin brushed against the cool metal, I watched the collective reaction of my biological family. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed play. The moment they saw my fingers touch the pen, a collective wave of relief washed violently over the three of them. The thick, suffocating tension that had gripped our table suddenly evaporated into thin air. Brad actually chuckled. It was a low, arrogant sound that vibrated with pure ego. He reached for his crystal wine glass, taking a large, victorious gulp of the expensive Cabernet Sauvignon he had purchased with stolen investor money. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of his own perceived brilliance. Richard let out a long, loud sigh and leaned back into the leather booth, aggressively crossing his arms over his chest like a king, watching his conquered subject bow before the throne. Susan immediately dropped her fake prayer hands. She smiled her bright, empty, terrifying smile. She actually had the absolute audacity to tell me that I was finally making a smart choice. She said that family always protects family and that I would be greatly rewarded for remembering my place. She told me that she would personally call the country club manager tomorrow morning to arrange a special celebration lunch just for the two of us. It was sickening. They were completely ready to sweep a multi-million-dollar federal fraud case under the rug and replace it with a fake toxic performance of suburban domestic bliss. I lifted the pen from the table. I held it between my thumb and forefinger. I moved my hand slowly toward the crisp white paper. I hovered the metal tip of the pen exactly 1 inch above the blank signature line. I held it there for 10 agonizing seconds. I wanted them to fully experience the absolute peak of their imaginary triumph. I wanted them to soar to the very highest altitude of their arrogant delusion because I knew exactly how hard the fall was going to be. The higher they flew, the more devastating the impact would be when they finally hit the concrete. I did not sign the document. Instead, I slowly lifted my eyes from the paper and looked directly into Brad's face. The smug, victorious grin on his lips began to falter just slightly as he realized my hand had stopped moving. The pen was completely suspended in the air. I let a slow, deep, and incredibly genuine smile spread across my own face. It was not a smile of submission. It was the smile of absolute, undeniable justice. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my entire body. I was finally cutting the heavy toxic chains that had dragged me down for my entire life. I opened my hand. I let the heavy silver pen drop. It hit the mahogany table with a sharp, loud clatter that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet space between us. The pen rolled away from the paper and fell harmlessly off the edge of the table, landing softly on the carpeted floor. Brad stared at the empty signature line, his brain failing to process what had just happened. Richard leaned forward, his face immediately darkening with renewed fury. He opened his mouth to shout at me, to demand that I pick the pen back up and do exactly as I was told. Susan gasped, her fake smile shattering into a look of absolute horrified confusion. But before any of them could speak a single word of protest, I adjusted the lapel of my tailored navy blue suit. I sat perfectly straight in my chair, radiating the absolute authority that I had earned through years of relentless hard work. I leaned my head down slightly toward my chest. I spoke in a clear, sharp, and incredibly steady voice, addressing the hidden federal microphone taped securely against my ribs. Did you get all that? The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Brad blinked twice, his brow furrowed in complete genuine confusion. He looked around the table trying to understand who I was talking to. He actually opened his mouth and asked me what on earth I was talking about. He thought I was having a mental breakdown. He thought the stress of the extortion had caused me to snap. He had absolutely no idea that his entire world was about to end. The response to my question was instantaneous and absolutely explosive. The table directly adjacent to our secluded booth had been occupied by two older men in sharp business suits who had been quietly eating their steaks for the past hour. The moment my words transmitted through the wire, both men stood up with terrifying coordinated speed. The casual atmosphere of the luxury dining room was instantly annihilated. Special Agent David Miller stepped away from his table and closed the physical distance to our booth in two massive strides. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket. When his hand emerged, he was holding a solid gold federal shield. He thrust the badge forward so it caught the warm ambient light of the restaurant, forcing my family to look directly at the ultimate symbol of federal authority. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Agent Miller announced. His voice was a booming, authoritative roar that completely silenced the entire restaurant. Dozens of wealthy patrons dropped their silverware. Waiters froze in the middle of the dining room, holding expensive bottles of wine. Every single eye in the establishment turned instantly toward our table. At that exact moment, the atmosphere outside the restaurant violently shifted. The heavy, dark rain clouds over the Chicago skyline were suddenly illuminated by a blinding, chaotic storm of flashing lights. Bright, piercing beams of brilliant red and vibrant blue violently swept across the massive front windows of the steakhouse. The flashing colors painted the faces of my family in alternating shades of panic and dread. The deafening, aggressive wail of multiple police sirens pierced straight through the thick glass, drowning out the soft classical music playing on the restaurant speakers. Federal vehicles were actively swarming the valet zone, physically blocking the leased Porsche SUV my family had used to arrive. Uniformed federal agents were pouring out of the tactical vehicles, moving rapidly toward the main entrance to secure the perimeter. The trap had not just closed. It had violently slammed shut with the force of a bank vault door. There was absolutely zero chance of escape. Special Agent Miller did not wait for my family to process the flashing lights. He moved with absolute tactical efficiency. He stepped directly beside Brad. Brad was still sitting in the leather booth, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had just been forcefully awoken from a deep sleep and found himself standing on the edge of a cliff. Agent Miller reached down, grabbed Brad by the expensive fabric of his custom gray suit, and violently hauled him out of the booth. Brad stumbled forward, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the carpet. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Agent Miller commanded. The raw physical reality of the situation finally hit my brother. The confident, arrogant chief executive officer completely vanished. The man who had ruthlessly stolen millions of dollars, forged his own wife's signature, and attempted to steal his sister's identity, was suddenly gone. In his place was a pathetic, trembling, terrified little boy. Brad began to physically shake. He let out a loud, high-pitched sob. He raised his hands in the air, frantically shaking his head from side to side. "No, wait! You do not understand!" Brad cried out, his voice cracking with pure terror. "I was just joking. We were just talking. Claire, tell them we were just talking." He was actively begging the sister he had just tried to blackmail to save him from the federal government. Agent Miller ignored his pathetic pleas completely. He grabbed Brad's arms forcefully, twisted them behind his back, and clamped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The loud, sharp, metallic clicking sound of the cuffs locking into place echoed perfectly over the screaming sirens outside. "You are under federal arrest for wire fraud, extortion, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice," Agent Miller stated clearly, reading the charges as he physically pushed Brad toward the front entrance. Behind him, the reality of the situation completely destroyed my parents. Richard let out a guttural, horrifying scream. He leaped up from the table, desperately reaching out toward his son. He screamed that there had been a massive mistake. He yelled at the federal agents, demanding that they unhand his boy. He looked absolutely unhinged, his country club blazer wrinkled and disheveled. The second undercover agent immediately stepped into Richard's path, placing a firm hand squarely on my father's chest and forcing him forcefully back into the booth. "Sit down and stay seated unless you want to join him in federal custody for conspiracy," the agent ordered sharply. Susan was completely hysterical. She was clutching the edge of the mahogany table, screaming at the very top of her lungs. She was crying, real authentic tears of absolute devastation. She watched in pure horror as two uniformed agents walked into the restaurant and took custody of Brad, forcefully marching her golden child out through the heavy glass doors and directly toward a waiting federal transport vehicle. She looked at me, her face completely contorted with a mixture of terror and realization. She finally understood the magnitude of what she had done. She had thrown away a daughter who could have protected her, and she had worshipped a son who had ultimately dragged their entire family into federal ruin. I sat calmly in my booth, taking one final sip of my sparkling water. I watched the flashing red and blue lights paint the dining room. I felt the cool, clean air of absolute freedom fill my lungs. The financial nightmare was officially over, and justice had been served cold, precise, and entirely on my terms. If you have ever been the scapegoat of your family, or if you have ever been told that you owe toxic people your loyalty just because you share their blood, I want you to remember this story. You do not owe anyone your silence, and you certainly do not owe anyone your future. Boundaries are not a sign of weakness. They are the ultimate weapon against manipulation. Do not let anyone convince you that protecting yourself is a betrayal. The real betrayal is expecting a child to set themselves on fire to keep their abusers warm. You have the absolute right to walk away to rebuild your life and to let toxic people face the natural consequences of their own horrific actions. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel if this story resonated with you. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know exactly what city or country you're watching from right now and what time it is there. I read every single comment, and I love connecting with people who understand the absolute power of choosing yourself. Stay strong and never forget your true worth. The heavy glass doors of the steakhouse swung shut behind the two federal agents who were dragging my brother out into the cold Chicago night. The entire restaurant had descended into a deathly paralyzing silence. The only sounds left were the rhythmic, piercing wails of the police sirens outside and the violent clattering of heavy toe chains. I turned my gaze toward the massive front windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, I watched as two large commercial tow trucks backed aggressively into the valet zone. The operators were systematically hooking thick steel chains to the axles of my family's leased Porsche SUVs. The bank was not wasting a single minute. The emergency asset forfeiture orders I had helped prepare were already being executed right in front of our eyes. My father Richard stood frozen by the mahogany table. His expensive country club blazer suddenly looked entirely too large for his deflating frame. He watched the tow trucks lifting his pristine luxury vehicle off the pavement, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. He could not comprehend that the carefully constructed illusion of his absolute superiority was completely dismantling in real time. Special Agent David Miller walked back into the dining room. He did not return to his adjacent booth. He marched directly over to my parents. He reached inside his dark suit jacket and pulled out two thick, folded legal documents printed on heavy federal stationery. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not lower his voice to spare their dignity. Richard Thomas and Susan Thomas, Agent Miller, said, his voice ringing with absolute uncompromising authority. "You are both hereby served with official federal summons. You are formally named as unindicted co-conspirators in an active federal wire fraud and corporate extortion investigation. You will be required to surrender your passports to the federal courthouse by tomorrow morning. If you attempt to flee the jurisdiction of the state of Illinois, federal marshals will hunt you down and you will be arrested immediately." My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She stumbled backward, her legs hitting the edge of the burgundy leather booth. She collapsed onto the seat, her manicured hands trembling violently as she stared at the federal summons resting on the table. She looked at the official government seals, completely unable to process the reality that her wealthy elite status had just been replaced with the terrifying label of a federal suspect. But the federal agents were not the only guests I had arranged for this spectacular evening. From the shadows of the restaurant lobby, a man in a sharp charcoal gray suit stepped forward. I recognized him instantly. He was the senior vice president of asset recovery for the regional bank that Brad had systematically defrauded. He walked up to our table with an expression of pure, unadulterated corporate vengeance. He did not even bother to look at my mother. He focused his cold eyes entirely on Richard. Mr. Thomas, the bank executive, said, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. My legal department has spent the last 48 hours reviewing the forensic audit provided by your daughter. We have thoroughly reviewed the cross-collateralization agreements you willingly signed to secure your son's fraudulent commercial loans. The executive reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a bright yellow legal notice. He slammed it down on the table, directly on top of my father's unfinished plate of expensive oysters. Because those loans are currently in catastrophic default. The executive continued, the bank is exercising its immediate right of seizure. This is your emergency notice of foreclosure and physical eviction. We have already dispatched a private security firm to your suburban residence. The locks are being changed as we speak. You are legally barred from entering the premises. You are officially evicted as of tonight. My father looked down at the bright yellow paper. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He looked up at the bank executive, his voice shaking with absolute disbelief. You cannot do this, Richard stammered, gripping the edge of the table. You cannot just throw us out onto the street in the middle of the night. Where are we supposed to sleep? We have absolutely nowhere to go. I sat perfectly still in my chair, watching the incredible poetic irony unfold. I looked my father dead in the eye and spoke in a quiet, incredibly steady voice. Perhaps you can find a nice, sturdy plastic garbage bag to sleep on, I said softly. I hear the front porch can be quite comfortable if you do not mind the rain. Richard flinched, as if I had physically struck him across the face. The memory of what he had done to me 7 years ago finally caught up to him. He was experiencing the exact same terrifying, helpless displacement he had forced upon his own 22-year-old daughter. He was finally feeling the absolute crushing weight of losing his entire world in a single night. But the absolute destruction of their toxic family dynamic was not yet complete. The heavy glass doors of the steakhouse pushed open one more time. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers spilled into the lobby, outlining the silhouette of 2 new arrivals. My heart swelled with a deep, profound sense of collateral justice as I watched my sister-in-law Jessica walk into the dining room. Jessica was a woman who had spent her entire adult life making herself small to accommodate Brad's massive, fragile ego. She was a sweet, underpaid kindergarten teacher who genuinely loved her students and trusted her husband implicitly. Tonight, however, there was absolutely nothing meek or submissive about her. She was wearing a simple trench coat, her hair pulled back tightly, and her eyes were burning with a fierce, protective fire. Standing directly beside her was a tall, imposing woman carrying a thick legal briefcase. It was the most ruthless, highly rated divorce attorney in the city of Chicago. Brad was currently being held by 2 federal agents in the restaurant lobby, waiting for the transport van to clear the traffic outside. Jessica marched directly up to the man she had promised to spend her life with. She did not cry. She did not scream or cause a dramatic scene. She moved with the cold, calculated precision of a woman who had finally woken up from a terrible nightmare. She stopped inches away from Brad. The federal agent stepped back slightly, allowing her the space to confront the criminal who had ruined her life. Jessica reached into her attorney's briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She slapped them firmly against Brad's chest. "These are divorce papers," Jessica said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet restaurant lobby. "I am filing for absolute immediate dissolution of this marriage. Furthermore, my attorney has already contacted the district attorney's office. I have seen the forensic audit files. I know exactly what you did to me. I know you forged my signature to secretly chain me to millions of dollars of your toxic criminal debt." Brad stared at his wife, his arrogant facade completely pulverized. He opened his mouth, trying to formulate one of his classic charming lies. He tried to tell her that it was all a misunderstanding, that he was just trying to provide a beautiful life for their future family. "Do not ever speak to me again," Jessica interrupted, her voice slicing through his pathetic excuses like a freshly sharpened blade. "I am formally pressing criminal charges against you for identity theft and corporate forgery. You are not just a fraud, Brad. You are a monster. and I'm going to make absolutely certain that you spend the rest of your pathetic life rotting in a federal prison cell." Jessica turned on her heel and walked out of the restaurant without looking back a single time. Her divorce attorney followed closely behind. I watched them leave feeling an incredible surge of respect for the woman who had just reclaimed her entire future. Brad simply crumpled. His knees actually buckled, and the federal agents had to physically hold him upright by his arms as they dragged him out the door and shoved him into the back of the waiting transport vehicle. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, completely locking away the golden boy of the Thomas family. The reality of the situation finally settled over our table. The entire illusion had been completely obliterated. Brad was gone, the bank accounts were frozen, the suburban house was locked and secured by private guards. The luxury cars were currently being towed to a federal impound lot. Susan looked around the dining room, her eyes darting frantically, searching for any possible escape route. She looked at the federal summons resting on the table. She looked at the bright yellow eviction notice sitting on my father's plate. She realized, with absolute terrifying clarity, that they had absolutely nothing left. They had no money, no home, no status, and no golden child to protect them. Then her eyes slowly locked onto me. I was the only person left in the entire room who held any trace of power. I was the wealthy, successful senior audit partner. I was the one wearing the expensive designer suit. I was the only life raft left in the freezing, terrifying ocean of their own making. Susan stood up from the leather booth. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely maintain her balance. She stumbled around the edge of the mahogany table, completely ignoring the stares of the wealthy patrons and the federal agents watching her every move. She dropped heavily to her knees right there on the expensive steakhouse carpet. My mother reached out with trembling, desperate hands. She grabbed the bottom hem of my tailored navy blue blazer. She clenched the expensive wool fabric in her fists, burying her face against my legs. She began to sob uncontrollably, a raw, wretched sound of total desperation. "Claire, please," Susan begged, her voice muffled against my clothing. "Please, you have to help us. We have absolutely nowhere to go. We have no money. You cannot just let the bank throw us out onto the street. You are my daughter. You are my beautiful, brilliant daughter. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. You are my only daughter. You owe this family." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. For 22 years, I had craved her affection. I had worked myself to the bone trying to earn a single scrap of her maternal pride. I had allowed her to make me feel small, invisible, and completely unworthy of love. But looking at her now, kneeling on the floor of a steakhouse, stripped of her fake country club arrogance and her toxic superiority, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no sadness. There was no pity. The psychological chains she had wrapped around my mind for my entire life simply dissolved into dust. I reached down and placed my hands firmly over hers. I did not do it with anger. I did it with the cold, absolute detachment of a woman who was finally completely free. I gently but forcefully pried her clutching fingers off the hem of my designer blazer. I pulled my coat away from her grasp and took a deliberate step backward, creating a clear physical boundary between us. I looked down into her tear-stained, terrified face. I let the silence stretch for a moment, ensuring she was listening to every single syllable I was about to speak. "I am not your daughter," I said, my voice echoing with quiet, unyielding finality. I paused, remembering the exact words my father had shouted at me as he slammed the heavy wooden door in my face 7 years ago. I remembered the rain, the cold, and the absolute finality of their rejection. It was time to return their toxic philosophy exactly where it belonged. "If you cannot sacrifice for the law," I said smoothly, mirroring the exact cadence they had once used to destroy my life, "you aren't part of my family." Susan let out a horrifying wail, dropping her face into her hands as the absolute reality of her abandonment crushed her. Richard just stared at the floor, completely broken, unable to even lift his head to meet my eyes. They were completely surrounded by the wreckage of their own criminal greed. I did not wait for them to say another word. I turned my back on them. I walked smoothly and confidently through the dining room, the heels of my shoes clicking a steady, powerful rhythm against the hardwood floor. I walked past the federal agents. I walked past the stunned, silent patrons. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool, refreshing Chicago night. The rain had stopped entirely. The city air smelled clean and full of electric possibility. I handed my ticket to the valet, tipped him generously, and waited for my car. When I finally slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. The terrified 22-year-old girl was completely gone. In her place was a woman who had faced her abusers, dismantled their toxic empire, and walked away with her soul entirely intact. If you are watching this video right now and you have ever been treated like an incredibly bad investment by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, if you have ever been the scapegoat, the workhorse, or the child whose needs were constantly sacrificed for the golden favorite, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your abusers your loyalty just because you share their blood. You do not have to set yourself on fire simply to keep toxic people warm. Setting firm, unbreakable boundaries is not an act of revenge. It is the ultimate act of survival. You have the absolute right to walk away from people who do not value your light, and you have the absolute power to build an incredible, beautiful life entirely on your own terms. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If my story resonated with you, or if it gave you the courage to stand up for your own worth, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most. And please drop a comment below, letting me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment, and I love connecting with a community that understands the true meaning of justice. Stay incredibly strong, protect your boundaries, and never let anyone tell you that you are anything less than extraordinary. Take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next story. The heavy glass doors of the steakhouse swung shut behind me, cutting off the chaotic screams of my parents. I stepped out onto the wet Chicago pavement. The rain had completely stopped. The air felt incredibly crisp and shockingly clean. I took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill my lungs. It tasted like absolute freedom. For 22 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my family and their endless demands. For 7 years after that, I had carried the invisible scars of their ultimate betrayal. But standing there on the sidewalk, I realized the weight was finally gone. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. The valet brought my car around. I handed him a generous tip and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine and pulled smoothly away from the curb. I did not look back at the restaurant entrance. I did not need to see them one last time. Instead, I looked in my rearview mirror. The reflection showed a chaotic sea of flashing red and blue police lights, painting the sides of the downtown buildings. The federal agents were doing their jobs. The transport vans were securing their targets. I drove down the empty city streets, watching those flashing lights slowly fade away in my mirror until they were completely swallowed by the darkness. The silence inside my car was beautiful. It was the sound of a closed chapter. It was the sound of true peace. I drove home that night with a quiet mind. I did not feel any lingering guilt. I did not feel any misplaced loyalty. I only felt the solid, undeniable satisfaction of justice running its natural course. People often wonder if it hurts to watch your own biological family fall apart. They wonder if a part of you breaks when you see the people who raised you lose everything. But forensic accounting teaches you a very important lesson about cause and effect. Every action has a corresponding reaction. Every stolen dollar carries a hidden cost. My family did not fall apart because of me. They fell apart because they built their entire lives on a foundation of lies, greed, and absolute selfishness. I simply refused to be the concrete that held their crumbling house together. Fast forward exactly 6 months. The wheels of federal justice are notoriously slow, but they are incredibly thorough. When they finally crush you, they leave absolutely nothing behind. The federal banking regulators and the Federal Bureau of Investigation completely dismantled Bradley Thomas and his luxury real estate empire. My brother did not have the opportunity to spin his narrative to the press. He did not get the chance to paint himself as a misunderstood visionary or frame his sister for his crimes. The forensic evidence I provided was entirely bulletproof. The recorded audio from the steakhouse was the final undeniable nail in his coffin. Faced with decades of potential prison time for wire fraud, extortion, and witness tampering, Brad's high-priced defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal. My brother, the golden child who believed he was destined to rule the corporate world, stood before a federal judge and pleaded guilty to every single charge. He wept openly in the courtroom. It was not a performance. It was the absolute terror of a narcissist who finally realized he was entirely out of options. The judge showed zero leniency. Bradley Thomas was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. There are no luxury country clubs in federal prison. There are no leased Porsche SUVs. There are no expensive dry-aged steaks or vintage wines. Brad is now living in a concrete cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his fabricated wealth. He spends his days following strict orders from prison guards. He has absolutely no power and no influence. The man who thought he could use people as disposable stepping stones is now completely isolated from society. He has 8 long years to think about every single life he tried to destroy, including his own wife Jessica, who successfully divorced him and ensured he would never touch her finances again. But the absolute hardest fall belonged to Richard and Susan. My parents had tied their entire existence to the illusion of superior wealth. They had sacrificed their own daughter to protect that illusion. When the federal authorities seized their cross-collateralized home, they lost the only real asset they had ever owned. The bank did not give them time to pack their expensive furniture or their designer clothes. They were physically removed from the property. Their bank accounts were frozen and drained to compensate the victims of Brad's Ponzi scheme. The people they used to impress at the Oakwood Country Club immediately cut all ties with them. High society is incredibly cruel to those who lose their money, but they are entirely merciless to those who are exposed as frauds. My parents were banned from the club. Their former wealthy friends stopped returning their phone calls. The people they used to drink champagne with pretended they did not even know the Thomas family. Richard and Susan became social pariahs overnight. Without their paid-off house and without Brad's stolen money funding their lifestyle, my parents faced a brutal new reality. They had zero retirement savings left. They were forced to move into a tiny, rundown, low-income apartment complex on the far outskirts of the city. The apartment has thin walls, stained carpets, and absolutely no luxury amenities. There is no manicured golf course. There is no valet parking. There is only the harsh daily struggle of survival. Richard was forced to take a minimum wage job working the night shift at a local hardware store just to pay their basic utility bills. He spends his hours standing on his feet, stocking shelves and taking orders from managers who are decades younger than him. Susan, who used to look down on working-class people, is now cleaning houses for cash under the table. The woman who once wore expensive cashmere coats now wears rubber gloves and scrubs other people's toilets. They live in constant miserable poverty. They spend their evenings sitting in their cramped living room, blaming each other for their ruined lives. They have tried to contact me exactly 3 times since the trial concluded. They sent letters written on cheap notebook paper, begging for financial assistance. They claimed they were struggling to buy groceries and pay their heating bills. They tried to invoke the sacred bond of family one last time. I took those letters, read them once to confirm their contents, and fed them directly into my office paper shredder. I did not send them a single dime. They made their choices, and now they are living the exact life they earned. I will never allow their toxic chaos to infect my world ever again. While their lives completely unraveled, my life moved forward with incredible momentum. The senior partners at my financial firm were absolutely astounded by the meticulous quality of the forensic audit I had compiled. The banking regulators specifically praised my work, detailing how my undeniable evidence saved them millions of dollars and protected countless innocent investors from complete financial ruin. Because of my handling of the Apex luxury real estate case, my career skyrocketed. 2 months after the trial ended, the board of directors called me into the main executive boardroom. They did not just give me a bonus. They formally promoted me to senior partner. At 29 years old, I became one of the youngest senior partners in the entire history of the firm. I now command a massive department. I dictate my own terms. I have built a level of wealth and security that Richard and Susan could only ever dream of faking. But my greatest achievement has absolutely nothing to do with corporate titles or high salary figures. The most important thing I built out of this entire ordeal is my foundation. When you grow up in a toxic household, you are conditioned to believe that you are completely alone. When your own parents throw you out onto the street, you're forced to navigate the world without a safety net. I remembered what it felt like to sit in that freezing motel room holding $270 and desperately wondering how I was going to survive. I remembered the sheer terror of financial instability. I promised myself I would never let another young person feel that kind of absolute hopeless despair if I could help it. I used a significant portion of my partner bonus to officially establish and fully fund a nonprofit organization. I called it the Independence Initiative. My foundation is specifically dedicated to providing comprehensive financial literacy education and direct academic scholarships to young adults who have been estranged from abusive, toxic families. We help young men and women who have been kicked out of their homes. We teach them exactly how to protect their social security numbers. We teach them how to build credit, how to invest safely, and how to navigate the banking system. We provide full-ride scholarships to students who have lost their familial financial support. We give them the exact same lifeline that I had to fight so desperately to secure for myself. Every single time I hand a scholarship check to a young student who thought their future was over, I feel a profound, deep healing in my own soul. I took the absolute worst pain my family ever inflicted upon me, and I transformed it into a weapon of mass protection for others. I turned their darkness into an undeniable blazing light. Looking back at everything that happened, I realized that the greatest lie we are ever taught is about the nature of family. People often say that blood is thicker than water. They use that phrase to force you to forgive the unforgivable. They use it to chain you to people who constantly drain your energy, your resources, and your happiness. They tell you that because you share DNA with someone, you are permanently obligated to tolerate their abuse, their greed, and their manipulation. But they forget one incredibly important detail. They forget that blood is exactly what attracts parasites. If you are the only successful person in a toxic family, you will instantly become a target. They will view you as a resource to be extracted. They will demand your money, your time, and your sanity. They will expect you to sacrifice your own future to fund their mistakes. And if you refuse, they will label you as selfish. They will call you a traitor. They will throw you out into the rain and tell you that you are entirely worthless. Setting a firm boundary with toxic family members is not a betrayal. It is an act of absolute survival. Walking away from people who actively harm you is the healthiest, most courageous decision you will ever make in your entire life. You do not owe your life to people who only view you as an emotional or financial ATM. You do not owe your peace to people who thrive on chaos. You do not owe your success to the people who actively try to destroy your potential. You only owe yourself the absolute best life you can possibly build. You owe yourself safety. You owe yourself peace. And you owe yourself the right to be surrounded by people who genuinely love you for who you are, not for what you can provide for them. My name is Claire, and I am a survivor of financial and emotional abuse. I am a highly successful senior forensic auditor. I am the founder of an organization that saves young adults from toxic families. I am a woman who walked through absolute hell and came out completely untouchable. I built my entire empire on truth, hard work, and uncompromising boundaries. And nobody will ever be able to take that away from me again. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace? Have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you because they only wanted to use you? Tell me your story in the comments below. I want to read about your courage and your survival. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice and healing. And please do not forget to comment your city, your state, and the current time so I know exactly where you are watching from. Justice can sometimes be incredibly slow. It can take years of silent struggling and quiet preparation, but when it finally arrives, it never misses its target. Keep building your life, keep protecting your peace, and never apologize for walking away from the darkness. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next story.